Good to go. I'd like to call the meeting to order. Good morning and welcome to the July 7th, 2021 Executive Committee meeting. We acknowledge that we are on the traditional lands of the Treaty 4 territory, a treaty signed with 35 First Nations across southern Saskatchewan and parts of Alberta, and Manitoba and the original lands of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. To ensure social distancing measures are being met during this time, some members of the City Administration are attending the meeting today through video conferencing. I would like to remind those who are attending through video conferencing of the following. Please ensure your video camera and microphone are turned off. If a member of council wishes to speak, use the raised hand function to be placed into a speaking queue. When speaking, remember to unmute your microphone and enable your video camera. All votes will be conducted with a recorded vote. I guess first up, we'll start with the someone to move the public agenda. Councillor Shaw. No one opposed, so it moves forward. Can I have a motion to approve the minutes? Councillor Bresciani.
Hawkins.
No one opposed, it moves forward. We'll start with the tabled report, delegation, tabled report number EX2145, Buffalo Pound Water Treatment Plant Corporation 2020 Annual Report. If I could get Barry Lacey to please introduce the report. Oh, I'm sorry. We have a delegation. We have Ryan Johnson from the Buffalo Pound Water Treatment Plant Corporation.
Hello?
Hi, Ryan, you're there? Please go forward and speak.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, Your Worship, members of City Council, City Administration, and the general public. To begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the land that the Buffalo Pound Water Treatment Plant is located on is Treaty 4 territory and home of the Métis. I am Ryan Johnson, President and CEO of the Buffalo Pound Water Treatment Corporation, and I'm very pleased to be here on behalf of the Board of Directors to present the 2020 annual report for the corporation. As both a critical and essential service, we've had to ensure that the water treatment plant was able to operate with sufficient staff and necessary resources to meet the water demands of the cities and communities in the region serving over the 260,000 people. Despite the disruptions and challenges and impacts from COVID-19, the corporation met all regulatory requirements and criteria for production of safe drinking water and met all of its obligations under the unanimous membership agreement with the cities. Highlights for 2020 include the 2018 to 2020 strategic plan was reviewed and updated, which will cover the years 2020 to 2023, with the plant renewal project being its main focus. The risk registry, which is a living document, is reviewed and edited internally every quarter and audited by third parties every 3 years to ensure that we are identifying and mitigating the major risks appropriately. The registry was audited in 2020 and only had some minor adjustments made. There are currently 39 risks identified that could impact the corporation and its ability to meet its mandate to the cities, and the risk profile decreased in 2020, and with the completion of the plant renewal project, these risks should be significantly reduced. As part of continual improvement, the corporation has been working on process changes that will decrease impacts to our customers. Trihalomethanes, or THM, formation has been a major issue in 2015 and 16 for both cities and Sask Water. In February 2020, we ceased the practice of pre-chlorinating the raw water before primary treatment, which has significantly reduced THM formation. This practice of pre-chlorination is not generally used and has basically eliminated over 70% of the THM formation at the plant and about 45% of the formation of THMs in the city's distribution system. Pre-chlorination will only be used as required for treatment in limited durations. With plant renewal project under design and anticipated to begin construction in early 2022, it was important to have a stable labor relations, and we were able to successfully reach an agreement with Unifor 595 to cover the years 2021 to years 2025, which should be the end of the plant renewal project. With COVID arrival in 2020, the impacts to water sales at the time were unknown. As a result, decisions were made to defer or delete operational expenses to minimize the chance the corporation will run a deficit. As it turned out, 2020 was rather a warm and dry year, resulting in water sales being close to the initial forecast, and this resulted in a surplus of about $1 million, which we used towards the plant renewal project. The capital projects progressed with the transmission line and computerized maintenance management system being completed. The lake pump station with backup generators, electrical upgrades, and more efficient pumps remains in progress and will be completed in 2021. In 2020, the plant renewal project progressed on schedule with no problems to date. The cities provided permission for the corporation to apply for the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Program. The design portion of the contract was awarded in June of 2020 to the Graham A.E. Con joint venture, with Stantec and Associated Engineers leading the design. The pre-design report was completed in October and finalized in December. For 2021, the initial detailed design development was completed in March, and this was reviewed, and several value engineering workshops were held to identify opportunities to improve efficiencies and reduce costs. This information will be included in the detailed design submission, and the project at a Class 2 estimate remains within budget. We were very excited to hear that the federal and provincial governments announced that the corporation was successful in obtaining $163.4 million for the plant renewal project, which is critical for the project's progression. Several months ago, the cities authorized the corporation to obtain proposals for financing up to $60 million to cover the shortfall for the project. And last month, both councils considered the matter of the loan, and they'll be making a final decision in July. The design and guaranteed maximum price should be completed in 2021, with construction commencing in early 22 and completed in 25, with a performance validation and warranty continuing for 2 years after the substantial completion. I would like to thank you for your time and be very happy to respond to any and all questions. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. Are there any questions for the delegate? Seeing no questions, thank you for the presentation.
Thank you very much.
I'll ask you to leave the meeting.
Okay.
We will now consider item EX 21-45, Buffalo Pound Water Treatment Plant Corporation 2020 Annual Report. Can I ask someone from administration to introduce the report? Mr. Lacey.
Thank you. Good morning, and through you, Mr. Chair. So the Buffalo Pound unanimous membership agreement between the corporation, the cities of Regina, and the city of Moose Jaw require the corporation to provide council with specific information annually, including its annual report, audited financial statements, and their budget for the upcoming year, which is this year, 2022. And so this report before you basically fulfills those requirements to provide council that information and have council have an opportunity to answer any questions you may have of that municipal corporation. As a result, the report before you is a receive and file report.
Thank you. Do you have any questions from committee? See no questions. Can I have someone move EX 21-45? Councillor Bresciani. Any comments?
It's pretty standard. I appreciated the report and the update.
See no other questions? Yeah. Okay. If there's no opposed, it's just a receive and file. I'll call that passed. I see no opposed. Moving forward. Next up, we have EX 21-47 and a delegation. I'd like to call upon Delegation Jess Richter of Art Gallery of Regina. Please introduce yourself for the record, the organization you represent, if any, and where you're calling from. You have 5 minutes to address committee, after which you will have the opportunity to respond to any questions the committee may have for you.
My name is Jessica Richter, and I am the director of the Art Gallery of Regina, and I am representing the Art Gallery of Regina.
Please go ahead.
Thank you for allowing me to present on behalf of the Art Gallery of Regina in regards to our lease agreement renewal with the City of Regina. I wanted to speak briefly about our organization, our relationship to the City of Regina, and how we adhere to and support the City's cultural plan, in reference to our hope that the AGR may continue to rent our space below market value due to the incredible work we do as a nonprofit public art gallery. Located on Treaty 4, the AGR promotes the development and appreciation of contemporary art with an emphasis on Saskatchewan artists. Our programming focuses on the voices and experiences of Saskatchewan artists and visitors, and our programming encompasses exhibitions, education, publishing, workshops, and artist talks. Through free public exhibitions and dedicated support for artists and innovation, the AGR has over 45 years as a supportive and creative cultural hub connecting artists in our communities. By focusing on work by artists with a connection to our community, we create opportunities and experiences for the people within our city to engage with art that speaks to ideas, issues, and content that are relevant to their time and place. We are an independent public art gallery with nonprofit and charitable status, and we are currently a tenant in the Neil Balkwell Civic Arts Center. We opened as an experimental satellite of the Mackenzie Art Gallery in 1974, and in 1976 we became an independent organization. And we began our tenancy in the Balkwell Center in 1984. We have a long history as being both a tenant and partner to the Neil Balkwell Civic Arts Center. During initial negotiations back in the 1980s, both parties viewed the agreement as more than a simple tenancy. It was a mutually beneficial partnership. This partnership has lasted throughout our time in the Neil Balkwell Civic Arts Center, creating new audiences and new opportunities for both organizations, as well as creating support for one another. Currently, the AGR rents below market rate, paying for their share of operation costs. We are very pleased with this arrangement and hope that this generous lease agreement can continue on. As a nonprofit charity, we rely upon core funding grants from municipal and regional sources to cover about 60% of our operating costs, and fundraise to cover the remaining 40%. Because we rely heavily on fundraising, it can be difficult to predict the amount of money we can receive from this. We are very appreciative of the excellent rate we have as tenants here, as it allows us to allocate more of our operating budget to our programming, especially as arts and culture departments across the country and funding agencies are often unable to raise core grant funding due to no fault of their own. As a community partner grant recipient, we work hard to ensure that we are supporting the City of Regina's cultural plan, which we do by creating free and accessible opportunities to connect with art, support and create cultural programming that is contemporary and reflects our place in time, and creates opportunities for local artists and creatives in the city, including amateur and recreational artists, as well as professional, established, and emerging artists. We achieve these goals through our free admission, Saskatchewan-centered exhibitions, free artist talks and studio visits, and our educational workshops. We cannot do these things without our generous tenancy and partnership through our lease, both financially as well as through our community-generating location in the Balkwell Center. We generate tremendous value for the City of Regina and the Balkwell Center, providing free access to contemporary art within a civic building, and enhancing the experience of clients at the Balkwell Center through their experiences with us. We fill a unique and very necessary niche within our community through our location and programming, and we look forward to continuing our partnership with the City of Regina through our approved lease renewal.
Thank you for your presentation. I see questions from Council. Councillor Shaw, please go ahead.
Thank you. Through the chair, I'd just like to ask you a question. Now that COVID is pretty much over, has your programming resumed? And if so, or when will it resume if it hasn't so far yet?
Thank you so much for that question. So our programming has actually been able to run relatively uninterrupted, with the exception of the closures when the Balkwell Center was closed. And we transitioned to online programming there. So we have been open to the public since, I would say, May, and all of our exhibitions are now going on as planned. We have slightly adapted in-person events, of course, to require masks with capacity changes, but other than that, we've been able to actually increase our programming during the pandemic.
Okay, that's encouraging to know. Can I ask just one more question? Just as the percentage-wise, your paid programming versus your free programming, is there a percentage that you could tell me about how much that you offer to the public through the chair?
Sure. Oh gosh, the percentage is hard to say. We don't charge admission for anyone to come into the gallery, so that is always free.
Okay.
The only thing we charge for are generally our professional workshops, where we need to make sure that we're paying the instructor, and pretty much the fees to that just go right towards paying the instructor.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
I see no other questions. Thank you for addressing the committee, and I'll ask you to leave the meeting.
All right, thank you so much.
Okay. We will now consider item EX21-47, Art Gallery of Regina lease, 2402 Elphinstone Street. Can I ask someone from administration to introduce the report? I believe that'll be Mr. Lacey.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. So the delegation, I think, did an excellent job describing the mutual beneficial relationship between the City of Regina and the Art Gallery. So maybe just to summarize for committee members, the Art Gallery Regina is seeking to renew their agreement to occupy the space within the Neil Balkwell Civic Arts Center, where the gallery has been located since 1984. This relationship has been beneficial both to the city and to the Art Gallery, providing the residents of Regina with exhibitions featuring established, emerging, and recreational artists, as well as education, publishing, workshops, and artist talks. Administration, the report before you is because administration is recommending approval of a renewal of this lease without public offering at lower than market rates, which require council approval.
Can I have a mover for the report, please? Councillor Stevens. Any questions from members on the report? Trying to watch all the screens. I see nothing flashing. No questions. Any comments, Councillor Stevens? No. I guess I'll call for a vote on the report then. All those in favor, or should I record? Okay. We'll have to do recorded vote on this one.
Thank you. I'll begin with Councillor Stevens, please.
Favor.
Councillor Stadnichuk.
In favor.
Councillor Hawkins.
In favor.
Councillor Bresciani.
In favor.
Councillor Findura.
In favor.
Councillor LeBlanc.
In favor.
Councillor Shaw.
In favor.
Councillor Zahidniak.
In favor.
Councillor Moole.
In favor.
Mayor Masters.
In favor.
Councillor Mancinelli.
In favor.
Passes 11-0, Deputy Mayor.
Okay. We will now consider item EX21-48, Dudney Avenue Corridor Rehabilitation Project, consulting services for over $750,000. Can I ask someone from administration to remove the report? Do I need to move it first, Amber? No. Can I ask someone from administration to speak to the report? Mr. Lacey.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. So the Dudney Avenue Corridor Rehabilitation Project is an integral component of the Yards Neighborhood Plan. The project will include rehabilitation, replacement, and or upgrading of buried municipal infrastructure to accommodate the anticipated servicing needs of the Yards neighborhood. In addition, Dudney Avenue between Albert Street and Broad Street will be transformed from its current state into a desirable landscape roadway with enhanced amenities to meet future needs for the Yards neighborhood and broader city needs for residents, businesses, road users, including pedestrians, cyclists, transit, and private vehicles. This section of Dudney Avenue will function as the primary access to and from the Yards neighborhood and is viewed as a critical prerequisite for subsequent mixed-use marketing and development of the lands within the Yards neighborhood. With that, we'd be pleased to answer any questions committee members might have.
Mr. Shaw, and I believe you're first up for questions as well.
Thank you. Through the chair, since we're doing this work between, or potentially going to be doing this work between Dudney, or between Albert and Broad, is there any potential companies looking at this place build has there been any interest in this land so far through the chair?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I'm going to refer that question to Mr. Moroz.
Yes, thank you to the chair. There has been some interest in this land. The position that we have is that we view the work on Dewdney Avenue as an investment into the land and into the neighborhood. We view it as a precursor to the development of the land. We have had some interest, but all of that interest is contingent on upgrades to Dewdney Avenue. We feel that if we upgrade Dewdney Avenue, we will be able to garner more interest. It's a recipe that's been tested and implemented across many cities in Canada, where the municipality goes in, invests in infrastructure, and then private investment follows. If we don't invest in this infrastructure, the project could be at risk of floundering. Good Chair.
So just a follow-up question to that. Now, before I have a history of listening to this, what all has been done before or up until now through the chair?
So through the chair, there's been considerable, I call it due diligence or background work on the Dewdney Avenue lands. There's been the neighborhood plan that was approved by council in January of 2020, and then subsequently by the province in April of that year. Considerable engineering work has been done on site. Environmental work, several phase 1 and phase 2 environmental studies, noise impact assessments, vibration analysis, and some market research as well.
So I'm trying to understand, will that information be lost, or this information needs to be added to the information that you've already collected through the chair?
Through the chair, no, that information is not lost. This work builds on that information. We view that information as solid background work for the land. Without that information, we are not in a strong position to actually invest in the infrastructure in the land and create the neighborhood that we want. It's basic infrastructure, basic information required for the development. It's not lost.
So just a follow-up question to that. You said that you need the land ready for what you want to develop. Do we have a plan of what we're going to develop there through the chair?
So there is a neighborhood plan that was approved by City Council January 2020.
So is that neighborhood plan going, is that a concrete plan through the chair?
Yes, through the chair, that is an officially approved plan, land use plan.
Okay, thanks. That's all I have.
Councillor Stevens.
Thank you. In principle, I do approve of the report and the request for these services. When council approved this neighborhood plan, we also amended it to require the plan itself and the development to be net zero in alignment with our sustainability framework. I don't see that explicitly referenced in this report. Will that be explicitly referenced in the RFP that goes out to market?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So two comments around that piece, and I'll ask Mr. Moroz to expand on it. So with respect to this RFP specifically, one of the requests of the consultant will be to bring into consideration environmental and sustainable practices as we rehabilitate that stretch of Dewdney Avenue. More broadly, we had this discussion when the neighborhood plan was approved. When we were looking at the more detailed concept design pieces, the commitment there was to come back with respect to sustainability and the discussion around the net zero plan and how that could be achieved. And perhaps I'll just ask Mr. Moroz if he has additional comment on the work that's being done around that, and then specifically with respect to this consulting contract going out.
Certainly, through the chair. That won't be a consideration in this RFP. This RFP is explicit to the Dewdney Avenue right-of-way. from Broad Street to Albert Street contained completely within the constraints of the right-of-way. The Yards neighborhood is the 17.5 acres immediately adjacent to that the Dewdney Avenue right-of-way, and that is where our efforts are focused in terms of net zero considerations.
Okay, thank you. Second component of this RFP in the report, Mr. Lacey, you did mention that we're seeing multimodal transportation options such as bike lanes, sidewalks, and perhaps a bus lane considered. Can I get a guarantee that those elements will be a requirement for applicants? So I don't want to see this report come forward a year from now and I miss all of those marks, even though we talked about it now. So can I get a commitment from administration when they review these applications that those multimodal transportation options will need to be considered and drafted by whoever is selected for this contract?
So through you, Mr. Chair, so the Dewdney Avenue corridor, as it was envisioned, would be a multi-modal transportation corridor that would include pedestrian, cycling, and auto transit as well. So that was pictured as the vision of rehabilitation of Dewdney Avenue here. So I do expect that those will be incorporated into the design components, and perhaps once again I'll just ask Mr. Murrows if he could expand further on what's envisioned with respect to the design of the Dewdney Avenue corridor.
Yeah, through the chair, yes, those are all things that are contemplated within the design. When we talk about rehabilitation of Dewdney Avenue, it's not simply new pavement and sidewalks, it's all those elements that Councillor Stevens referenced.
Okay, thank you.
Next up, we have Councillor Stadnichuk.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, a question regarding the trees that are in the design for the road. Part of the federal provincial plan for funding for the Yards area is a requirement for, I think, 500 trees to be planted. And the design for Dewdney Avenue rehabilitation also calls for trees along that. Will those trees be part of that 500, or is that 500 trees just for the Yards development?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I'll refer that question to Mr. Murrows.
Okay.
Through the chair, thank you for the question. You are correct. We will be planting many trees on Dewdney Avenue. The typical street trees, a Brandon elm, equivalent to an American elm, that over time becomes the beautiful street canopy that we love so much. Our agreement with the federal and provincial government is not explicit in terms of whether it's on Dewdney or the Yards together. It gives us some flexibility to plant at a minimum 500 trees. So it will be a combination of Dewdney and on the lands themselves.
Okay, thank you. I really am looking forward to seeing some trees on Dewdney Avenue. I don't think there is a single tree in that section. So it's a much needed, especially with climate change, the kind of heat wave that we've had. It's really important it'll be nice to see a tree canopy along that avenue. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Stadnichuk. Councillor Bresciani.
Thank you, through the chair. So what we're being asked here today is for to approve something over $750,000. What it would be the cost? What could be the cost that would be anticipated for this, through the chair?
So through you, Mr. Chair, so we're expecting the total consulting costs, if you include a contingency amount in that as well, to be around $1 million.
And how was that comparison done, through the chair?
Sorry, I missed.
How was that amount driven, the comparison? How do we come up with over 750? This is going to cost $1 million, through the chair?
So through you, Mr. Chair, I'll just refer that question to Mr. Moroz, maybe to get into a little bit more detail about the overall cost for the project and then how this particular component is determined.
Through the chair, thank you. Can I just get a bit of clarity on the question?
Through the chair, so I'm asking, the request is for over $750,000. Mr. Lacey's indicated could be the cost of $1 million in that. How was that cost come up? How did you drive to that it's not, it would not fit with under the 750 is my question.
Yes, thank you for the clarity. So it's based on a total percentage. It's an estimated percentage of the total cost of the improvements to Doonie Avenue right of way, which is about $14 million.
Thank you. So the question I know you've indicated that the land use plan was approved, the neighborhood plan. I remember the discussion well. I remember also we've talked just recently about looking at other entities on this land. If it'd be an arena, if it'd be a ball diamond. How does this now come into play if the neighborhood doesn't go and now we look at something else, and yet we've already moved forward with Doonie Avenue with these servicing needs when we don't really know what's totally going on the land yet? I guess I'm a little confused. It almost seems like we're putting the cart before the horse. Why wouldn't we develop what we know what's going to go on the lands in the neighborhood and then adjust it to that? Because entryways could be different, infrastructure, undergrounds could be different. I'm struggling with that we're moving too fast when we don't even know what's going into the neighborhood, into the yards area. So I need clarification there, please, through the chair.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair, and maybe I'll make some comments and then ask Mr. Moroz if he has any additional commentary. So the Yards Neighborhood Plan, which was approved by Council, is really a plan about land use, and it's mixed land use. Part of the parcel of land also in that neighborhood plan and land use document does allow for potential for a recreational or a large complex such as that to occur. So that was contemplated as a potential use of part of that land. And the final piece I'd say is that Council always has the ability, you have land developers always coming back through the Regina Planning Commission who are making changes to their concept plans and their neighborhood plans. And so there's always a potential, if there is a need to change that plan in the future, to come forward and go through that approval process. The Doonie Avenue rehabilitation project we really think is foundational, not only for the yards but for the overall neighborhood there, transforming what is currently pretty much was built as a transportation corridor when the CP yards were there, more into a pedestrian, community-friendly road network. And we believe that's foundational basically with respect to the development for the community overall, but as well for the Yards neighborhood, which is south of Doonie Avenue there, with respect to attracting investment and interest in that entire parcel of land. Basically, it adds value overall to the land, and as Mr. Moroz has indicated, well, there's been interest expressed by a number of parties. Many of them would like to see that Doonie Avenue corridor moved into a more pedestrian, residential, business-friendly environment prior to making those type of investment decisions. And with that, I'll ask Mr. Moroz if he has any additional comment he would like to provide.
Certainly, through the chair. Regardless of what happens on the land, there are technical things that need to happen to the infrastructure on Doonie Avenue. The pipes are 100 years old. They're at the end of their life. They're insufficiently sized for the land and the neighborhood as a whole. And before we can accommodate any use, whatever it may be, we need to have the proper infrastructure in place. If we're going to go and upgrade the underground infrastructure under Doonie, the right time to upgrade the surface infrastructure is at the same time. We don't want to go and polish up the Dudney Avenue streetscape and then come in a few years later and dig it all up and replace some underground pipes. So regardless of the land use, there's some technical things that need to happen with respect to that basic infrastructure.
Thank you. So just elaborate on your point. If there was a recreation facility on that land compared to housing and commercial neighborhood, would the density not change, and the pipes and the infrastructure underneath, wouldn't that change as well, through the chair?
Yes, through the chair, that is correct. We're erring on the side of contingency. We're erring on the side of safety. We're assuming the most significant load on the system, which would be residential uses. So if the pipe needs to be this big, we're making it this big.
Okay. The last question I have is regarding the environmental piece, and you've indicated that phase 1 and phase 2, or stage 1 and stage 2, was done. What if, and I guess I'm going to play devil's advocate, what if the environmental comes back and it's, in the millions and millions of dollars that this land is undevelopable, or it's going to cost that much to clean it up? Can you just provide some feedback on the environmental piece at this location, please, through the chair?
I said we've done considerable environmental studies have been done on these lands. We're currently remediating 3 priority locations that have some materials in the soil that we're going to haul away to an off-site storage facility. And then once we're done that, we'll have we will produce something called a corrective action plan, which is the guiding document for the ultimate remediation of the lands. That document gets registered with the province, and it is a contingent element to development of the lands. Of course, we can't develop on anything that has any level of contamination. Our preliminary estimates or preliminary budgets on the remediation are not such that it would preclude development from a financial point of view.
Okay. And I guess just this is my last question, sorry. Normally when, and correct me if I'm wrong, if a developer goes in to purchase land, would that not be up to the responsibility of the developer who's going to develop that land to look after some of the undergrounds? Now, it depends on if the land's sold or if it's, how does that work? So, I mean, the city's paying for this. Is that typical that the city would be paying for the infrastructure on this roadway and not sharing it with the developer, whoever may develop that land, through the chair?
Through the chair, so when we go to market these lands to the ultimate users, whether it's through a lease or through a sale, we will do that at market rates, and the costs of development will be worked into our budgets. Now, I wouldn't expect a private developer to make infrastructure upgrades to Dudney Avenue. We view that as an investment from the municipal side into that infrastructure to attract the private investment.
Okay. That's all I have. Thank you.
Councillor Hawkins.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I have 2 questions. The first is with respect to the federal government contribution to the Dudney Avenue Corridor Rehabilitation Project. Could the administration refresh my memory on what that contribution is, when the monies start to flow from that contribution?
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. So there were 3 parties to that agreement, and so it's a 1/3 contribution by each level of government. So the federal government's contribution is 1/3, as is the provinces, and then the municipality shares 1/3 as well. And that 1/3 share is just a little over $11.2 million. And the total funding for that project, the agreement is that it would be spent by March 31st, 2028. And how reimbursement occurs is that as those funds are expended, basically an invoice or bill is provided to the funding partners, and then they provide their share of that cost that was incurred related to the project.
Follow-up, will any part of these current professional services fees be invoiced to the federal and provincial government, or the provincial government, or were these entirely on the city?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I will ask Mr. Morose to expand on that.
Through the chair, these professional engineering fees are deemed an eligible expense through the agreement. So yes, we will be invoicing the provincial and federal governments for this work, for their share of this work.
Thank you very much. The second question arises out of the important question that Councillor Stadnichuk raised. With respect to the trees, I just want to be sure that I understood the answer. The trees that are being planned for the Dudney Avenue rehabilitation are real trees, that is canopy trees, trees like you see in Cathedral or Old Lakeview, and not stunted fake trees that are really just shrubs that you see along the major corridors in the new subdivisions. Can I get confirmation on that?
There are 3 species of trees. There's the American elm, that's the textbook street tree that you see throughout most of Regina and the older neighborhoods. That tree is no longer supported because of Dutch elm disease. Brandon elm is the newest variety of that tree that also yields a street tree canopy, as well as a particular species of ash, the species name I forget offhand. But between the combination of the Brandon elm and the ash trees, the net result over time, of course, is a street canopy.
Thank you very much. I'm very encouraged by that, and I look forward to seeing that reflected in the consultant's designs coming forward. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Councillor Hawkins. Next up, we have Councillor Zakiniak.
Thank you. So I just have a question about the environmental impact section. The last line there says that the consultant, as part of the design, will be exploring options to implement energy efficient improvement. So that appears to refer to something different than the environmental considerations mentioned elsewhere in the report. So I'd just like some more information about that through the chair, please.
To you, Mr. Chair, I'll ask Mr. Morose to expand upon what we'll be asking the consultant to look at.
Right. So through the chair, the new roadway will not just be a 6-lane corridor designed to move vehicles back and forth as quickly as possible. There will still be the opportunity to move the amount of vehicles through that corridor. However, with the geometric design of that streetscape, it's intended to slow it down. It's intended to provide a more pedestrian experience. It's intended to make it easier to cross Dudney Avenue. There'll be restrictions at intersections where the roadway actually gets a little bit narrower. And of course, with the landscaping elements and some other soft infrastructure elements, it's a bit of an abstract concept in terms of environmentalism. It's not like we're going to build a house and make it super energy efficient and therefore use less natural gas. It's a neighborhood level environmental sort of initiative where if we can focus some efforts more on the people side of the neighborhood and less so on the vehicular side of the neighborhood, it has some environmental benefit. So it's a bit of an abstract concept. It's not, like I say, an explicit thing, but we will be asking them to investigate those things that are a little more gray. To the chair.
Okay. Okay, thank you. That's all I have.
Thanks, Councillor Zakiniak. Councillor Shaw.
I have a few questions, but one question is, so we're going to be doing this work. Can you tell me, now I'm kind of getting a mixed signal here. I wasn't quite sure, just need some clarification. When Councillor Hawkins said that this will be shared and billed to the federal from the money that we receive, so of this $750,000, is any of this going to be shared through each of the provinces? Is this all in the city through the chair?
So through you, Mr. Chair, whatever the expenditure is, the reason this is before you is because we anticipate it'll be more than $750,000, which requires your approval to enter into that consulting contract. But say it is $1 million, those services are eligible for recovery from the other two levels of government.
Okay.
So if it is $1 million, let's say, 2/3 of it would be recovered from both the province and the federal government through the agreement we have with them.
Okay, so you are out, we need approval because it's over 750, but it doesn't mean that the city will have to pay the 750 through the chair.
That's correct. We'll pay for our 1/3 portion of whatever the actual cost is.
Okay, thank you. So another follow-up question. Now, I'm going back to my days in real estate and stuff. These studies that you're doing and this work that you're doing, does it have a time stamp on it that, so if we don't build a certain condo or if we don't build something within 5 years and we got to go back and do it again through the chair?
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair, I'll ask Mr. Morose to respond to that question.
Through the chair, I think if you're referencing the neighborhood plan, that neighborhood plan stands. I don't think there's an expiry on a neighborhood plan, at least I'm not aware of one.
No.
And once land is zoned, it's zoned permanently. And with respect to any of the background work, that doesn't have any expiry on it as well. It's all foundational to the investment in the land.
And that's kind of where I was going with this, because I know when you're buying a piece of property, sometimes they'll call for an environmental impact assessment to be done, the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. That falls on the person that's buying the land, but that has an expiration date if he sells it again, so on and so forth. So I'm just wondering, I'm sorry, I'm just trying to figure out to make sure that this is being done and it's not going to expire, because we honestly don't have people lined up to say we're going to buy all this land. So in 10 years, when we finally sell a piece of the land, will we have to do this all over again? I'm just trying to, through the chair. Thank you.
Yeah, through the chair. So all the environmental work that we're doing right now is our responsibility as the land developer to get the land cleaned up. When we're done, we'll have a certificate of compliance, and indeed, the vast majority of investors, developers, banks will insist on a clean environmental. Okay. Clean environmentals have an expiry of 1 year. They're only good for 1 year. Exactly. And as the land developer, we will gladly provide a clean environmental to any potential purchasers or lessees.
So like I said, that's only good for 1 year through the chair.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I'll perhaps ask Mr. Morose to expand. So all of the work we've done to date to determine what level of environmental contamination exists on that site, that does not expire. That identifies what the environmental impacts are.
Right. The
work undertaken to remediate that doesn't expire. That value continues to exist into the future. I believe what Mr. Morose has articulated is that once all that work's done, you still need to get a certificate to give you a sort of a clean bill of health. And that clean bill of health expires after 1 year. But if nothing has changed on that land, I think it's a pretty normal process and a pretty easy process just to get another clean bill of health, as long as nothing has been done on that land subsequent to remediation. And perhaps I'll just ask Mr. Morose to confirm that.
Yeah, through the chair, that is confirmed. That's correct.
sorry, I'm just having a hard time trying to wrap my brain around this to say, we don't have anybody ready to buy the land. We know we have something coming forward to us within the next month. Can we wait to approve this until after we know that something's coming forward to us in the next month, whether that's going to get approval? Because that will change how this is going to happen. Is that correct, through the chair?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So maybe I'll just make a couple of comments around that piece. I do know that there is some parties interested in that land, and those discussions I think will unfold over the next little while. Ultimately, whether or not that ends up resulting in something there, I think is to be determined in the future. When we talk about the Dudney Rehabilitation Project and some of the underground, so there's the above ground kind of visual aspects, there's the underground as well. And we know that there are infrastructure capacity issues in that part of the city. And so any growth that occurs there is going to require us to address that issue. And so when we are undertaking this rehabilitation of Dudney Avenue, a part of that will be replacing the waterworks and the pipes. That in part will be done in a manner that helps address the overall capacity issues and the age of those pipes underneath the ground. So I think if you talk, so from a waterworks perspective, we believe this is important work regardless. Overall, with respect to the project itself and kind of more the visibility and above ground pieces, in part the original vision was, I believe, when the city initiated the Regina Revitalization Initiative, which had three components to it. One was obviously the stadium, the new stadium. This was the second component, to revitalize those lands and in the broader downtown area. Part of it was envisioned as a city building effort as well, which also include kind of renewing that whole area. And I guess I come back to, regardless of what type of features and what type of land use ultimately is undertaken there, that we believe that this infrastructure investment is critical and will not go to waste regardless. The other concern we do have is timelines. As I mentioned, we have until March 28th to use the program dollars that have been approved by the feds and the province on this. So we do know the clock is ticking. And so we are concerned that the longer that we delay this, the more at risk we are to basically get $2/3 dollars from the feds and the province for every dollar we spend on this.
So just kind of another question, obviously. You talk about how we have infrastructure capacity concerns, and we have infrastructure capacity concerns with land that's already developed, with stuff already on the land. So I'm having a hard time trying to figure out why we don't focus on stuff that's already built and the infrastructure and the concerns that we're having, and then now we're going to put money into this, and we don't even know if it's going to be built. We have something coming forward to us within the next month that could change the dynamics of what we have to do to this land to prepare it to be built. And now we're asking to have this all done before we fix concerns that we already have with buildings that are already in our city, and potentially we have nothing there that's going to go in that area. So can you help me understand this through the chair, why this is necessary? And I understand about the funding, but I'm just having a hard time with this. Can you just please clarify this for me through the chair?
So, through you, Mr. Chair, perhaps I'll just make a few comments, and then I will ask again Mr. Morose for his perspective on the work being contemplated here and how it will be beneficial regardless of what other development might actually occur. If further information is required with respect to kind of the infrastructure and the state of the infrastructure, I'll perhaps ask Mr. Onright to speak to that as well. So first off, maybe I'll just refer the question to Mr. Morose if he could expand upon basically our perspective that this is needed work regardless of what ultimately goes on those lands from a broader, from my perspective, it's with respect to a broader city building perspective. It's with respect to dealing with infrastructure matters. It's with respect to enhancing that overall neighborhood, just not the lands that we're looking at developing, but on the other side, north of Dudney Avenue as well. So, Mr. Moroz, I will ask if you have any additional comment with respect to the concern being expressed that we may expend dollars in designing Dudney Avenue that may not be reflective of what actually is developed there and suitable for what's developed there, I think is what the question is.
Right, so through the chair, I'll probably answer a few of these questions. Regardless of what happens on the land, we need to make upgrades to Dudney Avenue. The trees, the infrastructure, the streetscape, everything. I'll speak to infrastructure. In terms of existing issues, certainly there are many issues with respect to existing infrastructure capacity problems across the city. And I can't speak for everybody, but I know people are working on mitigating those issues or managing or improving or fixing those problems. As a developer, and I can speak for many. If you've got $1 and you want to invest it in a city, you look for the cities that have invested in infrastructure. Without infrastructure, you have nothing for growth. You don't have sanitary capacity. If you don't have water capacity, you literally cannot build anything. So as an investor, if I've got $1 and I've got a city that I want to go to, I'm going to find a city that has an infrastructure regime that is supportive of growth. And that means having the right size pipes, the right size water, the right size sanitary. It's very basic stuff. But without that, growth is much more difficult. So regardless, I'll go back here. Regardless of any of the uses on the land, we need to have the right size pipes in the ground. We have to have capacity to accommodate whatever uses might be there. I'm not sure if I answered your question. I could probably go on at length on this topic, but glad to answer more questions if so desired.
Mr. Holden.
Through Mr. Chair. So I think it's really important to reinforce, and it's been said a number of times. So this is a city building project. We need to make sure that Dudney Avenue is kind of a catalyst investment by the city. The city needs to make that investment, and we have the luxury of being able to leverage 2/3 of that investment from provincial and federal partners. And yes, there are some conversations and interest. It has been out in the public that, there's a private investor that wants to look at potentially a home for the Red Sox. Those conversations are occurring right now, but they're not going to come in front of council in the next 30, 60 days. There's a lot of work that would need to be done to explore whether the feasibility of what that private investor is proposing is a possibility. And then, of course, it would have to come in front of council for consideration. So the beautification of Dudney, making sure that the infrastructure that we need to support what exists there today and allow for any growth, that's what this project is about. So it's been, indicated by both Mr. Moroz, right, and Mr. Lacey, that this is not a lost investment. This is an absolutely essential investment to drive growth and to stimulate some exciting development within these spaces. And the neighborhood plan has a combination of residential, commercial, it has some public spaces, some public facilities, and it was specifically designed to leave the flexibility to have, whether it's an arena complex, whether it's a ball complex, or some other type of significant entertainment opportunity on that site. But the site will be a combination of uses, and the city needs to take a leadership role in terms of making an investment to be a catalyst to drive additional investment. And Mr. Moroz, I think, has explained it very well. We need to make the investment so that the private sector investors say, I want to go to Regina, there's an exciting opportunity, and I want to be a part of it. And that's happening in other cities across Western Canada. So that's why the report is here in front of you. We're not putting the cart in front of the horse. This is the right investment to make. It's the right time to do it. And we want to take advantage of investment from both the federal and provincial governments.
Thank you, Mr. Holden.
Just a follow-up statement to that, and I hear what you're saying, especially with the 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. That's, I mean, how do you not take that? And I get that, and I understand that, I get that, and I appreciate the fact that it is 1/3. I'm just very leery, and this is a good thing, but we just seem to put money in, and then we're like, okay, eventually. Our downtown is hurting, and we all know what's going on with that. We all know that how people are having a hard time trying to build down there because of the things that are going on. And I appreciate the work that's been done with this, and I obviously, we as city administration and as city council, we can't not take advantage of the 1/3 thing. That's kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, that of course, obviously we should be doing this. So I appreciate that. I appreciate answering all the questions. And I'm sorry, I had so many questions and just needed to get the details in order for me to go forward and approve this or not approve this for the people in the city. Thank you. That's all I have.
Thanks, Councillor Shaw. Councillor Bresciani.
Just to follow up, this is coming back in Q2 2022 to council, and is as far as the design, and will that also go to the accessibility as well?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So I want to be clear here, and I'll ask Mr. Morose to confirm this. So the timelines here are with respect to when we expect construction to start and to be completed. There wouldn't be an item that comes back here to council with respect to the beautification of Dudney Avenue. So we do anticipate construction would start in Q1, we're hopeful, and be completed, I think, by Q2 or 3. I'll just ask Mr. of 2023. I'll just ask Mr. Morose to confirm that.
Through the chair, so we're striving to start construction in Q1 2023 and complete in Q4 2024. And accessibility, of course, will be contemplated in the details.
Sorry, so through you, Mr. Chair, maybe I'll just expand my comments with respect to not coming back with formal approval. So there will, as obviously as this is designed, there will be further consultation with the warehouse bid as an example. The initial design elements, when the neighborhood plan was put together, there's a lot of consultation leading up to that piece, and as well with respect to accessibility and some of the accessibility features. There would be obviously consultation with the Accessibility Advisory Committee, et cetera, around design pieces of the piece. So just wanted to provide additional clarification around the fact that there is further consultation that will be happened as that design happens, just not back to council overall as a design framework. Those dates in the report related to construction timelines.
But Accessibility Advisory would go there. It'll go to the Accessibility Advisory Committee. I think you said that.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I think as part of the design, we'll ensure that we have those conversations with the Accessibility Advisory Committee as that design is undertaken.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Bresciani. Councillor Hawkins, I see your hand up. Do you have another question, or is it just remained up?
I do have another question. I'm sorry I didn't ask them all, but my question is triggered by some of the environmental questions that have been asked. What's going on here is essentially the design of a new subdivision. And in olden days, when you built a new subdivision, you put a pipe in that brought in drinking water, clean water for high-level purposes, and then another pipe that took away all the wastewater and the drainage water and stuff. there's some environmental discussion about how new piping systems would separate the highly treated drinking water from water used for purposes like washing your car or growing your grass or whatever, and then separated wastewater into wastewater and just gray water from drainage. My question is this: is the piping system that's envisaged under Dudney Avenue to service this new subdivision, is that the old-fashioned kind of system, one pipe in and one pipe out, or is it a more sophisticated system that will separate water coming in and water going out according to their various uses?
Mr. Onright. Or Mr. Lisi.
Through the chair. I would say at this point in time it is the standard system. It'll be oversized as the discussion has talked about the development of that property. The utilities that are going in to accommodate volume in the entire warehouse district. And, you know, I think, Councillor Hawkins, when you refer to fresh water or potable water being able to be split off, our potable water comes from Buffalo Pound, single line, and that is the potable water system. The only way to get around that is to run separate lines out of bypassing Buffalo Pound or bringing it in out of a well system. So initially we have not considered that in this particular development.
Thank you, Mr. Onright, and I appreciate the complexity of this. My observation would be that going forward, given our commitment to be a renewable city by 2050, this is something that should be considered at some appropriate moment. In other words, we shouldn't just set this aside because it's complicated, but at some point we may have to start to consider how we use water. I say that especially because water on the prairies, and especially this region of the prairies, is going to become a scarce resource. We're going to have to be more careful than we've been in the past. Thank you very much for the answer. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Hawkins. Mr. Onright has a comment.
Through the chair, Councillor Hawkins, just a bit of information on the wastewater side. That is being considered out of our wastewater treatment plant, the wastewater coming out of the plant being utilized for industrial development. So there have been many discussions about that, and there has been some work around that as of current.
Thank you, Mr. Onright. Just a comment. I believe there was a grey water strategy motion passed for Regina, especially with our water challenges in our city. So just to put that on the table too. Mayor Masters.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, through you. I have a question relative to Dudney Avenue between Broad and Albert Street, as that's what this motion is for and this investment is for. What has been done to date? There's been much discussion about work being done elsewhere, but what's been done to date or money been spent to date as it relates to Dudney Avenue revitalization specifically?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I think I'll refer that to, I'm not quite sure, with respect to Dudney Avenue specifically, I think the work that's been done has been part of the broader discussion about the Yards neighborhood plan and the beautification of it, and there's been some design elements that have been shared as part of the neighborhood plan. I would say the work to date has pretty much been kind of that high-level preliminary design coming out of community consultation.
Okay. And through you, Deputy Mayor, in terms of the $1 million spend, there's comments relative to preliminary design, detailed design, construction services for the Dudney Avenue revitalization. So if I asked you, what do we get for $1 million once it's spent? What does that look like? We have all the design plans, everything ready to go, and we're just sending a project out to tender after the $1 million is spent, and roughly $1 million potentially.
Through you, Mr. Chair. So it's very similar, I would maybe characterize it as when you build a building, you have an architect that builds your design plans, and then you go out with those design plans to actually have someone build your building. So this is really what this is to basically get your design plans that then you would go to market. Someone would then actually do the construction work based on those designs.
And so those designs will be for the north side of Dudney Avenue relative to the trees and the pathway or the sidewalk, as well as underground services for sewer and water.
That's correct.
Okay, and then what's next? And I know, and I apologize, Mr. Morose, I think you had kind of worked it into one of your statements. So what's next is it goes out for tender, work starts, and are you coming back, or is that within the 5-year capital plan relative to the money being spent? Or is that already approved in terms of the construction work that's going to go forward? There's a $14 million number in here. Has that already been approved?
Through you, Mr. Chair, so that would be part of the 5-year capital plan. I'll ask maybe Mr. Morose if he has the details about where it is in the 5-year capital plan, whether that's been approved already or whether it's in the future years of the plan. Mr. Morose?
Through the chair, yeah, I mean, it's coincident with the construction schedule that's in front of you, the spend over the next 3 to 4 years.
Thank you. And so really the request just before us is for an additional potential $250,000, give or take, and a third of that would be about $83,000 for the city, essentially, is what we'd be looking at over what you're already able to spend within existing bylaws.
Through you, Mr. Chair, that's correct. I think the important part here is whatever that total price tag is, the city's only spending 1/3 of that amount. So basically we're getting, overall, we anticipate this will be around $14 million. So the actual cost to the city, we're going to get a $14 million rehabilitation of Dudney Avenue for 1/3 of the cost that it would take if we did it ourselves.
Thank you. I think it's a great use of tri-party money in terms of investing in our city. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And I guess I see no other questions. With that, I'll have the clerk call the vote.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. I'll begin with Councillor Shaw, please.
In favor.
Councillor Zahidniak.
In favor.
Councillor Stadnichuk.
In favor.
Councillor Hawkins.
In favor.
Councillor Stevens.
In favor.
Councillor Bresciani.
In favor.
Councillor Finjura.
In favor.
Councillor LeBlanc.
In favor.
Councillor Moll has left the meeting. Mayor Masters.
In favor.
Councillor Mancinelli.
In favor.
Carries 10-0, Deputy Mayor.
Okay. Next up, we will consider item EX 21-49, multi-year budgeting. Can I ask someone from administration to introduce the report? Mr. Lacey.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. So I think Council is aware that one of the key priorities in the city's official community plan is achieving long-term financial viability. Budgets that look out more than 1 year make it easier to determine the long-term impacts of decisions made today. And so multi-year budgeting, in our view, does help achieve long-term financial viability. We also know that there are more and more cities adopting multi-year budgeting. And so we thought it would be useful for us as the City of Regina to examine the benefits and disadvantages of a multi-year budget approach that encourages increased focus on long-term financial viability. The advantages and disadvantages of multi-year budgeting were examined, and a review of other cities was conducted by administration. Based on this research, we're recommending that the City of Regina adopt a multi-year budget starting in the 2023 budget year. And it's recommended that that budget be a 2-year budget, with the first budget being for the years 2023 and 2024. The operating budget would show 2 years, with the second year approved in principle, and with then council approval occurring each year of the specific mill rate. The current the current capital budget process would remain essentially unchanged, as we have a 5-year capital program right now, with the first year being approved by council, but the adjustment would be the second year would also be approved in principle, consistent with the 2 years in the operating side. And I just would note that it's important that while council would be approving a 2-year budget, there's always that opportunity in the second year to make adjustments if there's significant things that happen that weren't anticipated, or there were council priorities in the interim that council wished to address. 2 years is recommended, as we believe it's a reasonable trade-off between long-term financial viability and not looking too far into the future for budgeting, where it's difficult to predict, particularly when this is an inaugural multi-year budget process that we're recommending here. I would also note the 2-year operating budget approach is similar to the approach Saskatoon implemented for their 2020 and 2021 years. And if the recommendations in this report are approved, the next steps would be for administration to move forward with implementation, which includes the creation of a multi-year budget policy and consultation with some of our key stakeholders that are incorporated into our budget. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Mr. Lacey. I'll be looking for a mover for this report. Looks like Councillor Hawkins has his hand up. I'll take him as my mover. And do you have any questions, Councillor Hawkins? Or maybe his hand was left up. Okay, I'll take my second in line, which was Councillor Stevens, and he can start with the questions then.
Appreciate this report, the overview, and moving in this direction. Perhaps you could talk us through the logistics of what a budget meeting would look like under this model. So from the public standpoint, you know, it's an opportunity for directing council and administration on where to spend, but you've already done the work. So we're doing a 2-year budgeting process. Seems to be much like what we've done for utility. We'd still have an annual budget meeting, but the forecasting, the mill rate, much of the spending, capital and operational, would be spread over 2 years, but we would still meet on an annual basis. Is that correct?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So maybe thank you for the opportunity to expand a little bit more on what it would look like, because I think that's an important question, and I do think it would look a little bit different than what we do with the utility budget right now. So right now, council gets an annual budget book that provides significant details on both the revenues and expenses of the organization. I would see that budget book being very similar to what council currently receives, except you're going to get 2 years now of budgeted information on the operating side. You're only getting 1 year right now, which is the year that you're approving for the upcoming year. So now you'll get 2 years worth of that detail. And so in that first year, that budget book would be produced. Council, as it always has in the past, I don't see that changing much in that first year of the multi-year budget. We would still have the same discussion debate occurring, except it would be about the 2 years being proposed, not the 1 year. In that first year, after that debate is finished, council then would approve the overall 2-year budget, and then along with that, it would approve a mill rate for the first year of that budget, because legislation only allows council to approve a mill rate on an annual basis. So that would be year 1. Year 2, what we're envisioning would happen here is we would not reproduce that budget, but what instead would happen is we'd bring a report forward that would talk about any exceptional circumstances that may have changed since council approved that second year in principle. Council at that time obviously would have an opportunity to make adjustments and changes as well. So there would be another budget meeting in the second year of council to basically then approve that second year and to approve a mill rate associated with that second year. What we're hopeful and what's anticipated by this process is any changes would typically be, you know, for significant things that have happened in the economy, i.e. a pandemic happened after council approved that initial budget as an example, or perhaps a significant priority has come up that council feels it should be addressed in that second year that was not contemplated or known when that initial 2-year budget was brought forward. So council still would meet and approve and have approvals in that second year, but that process would be significantly slimmed down, so to speak, and only focus on significant changes.
Okay, thank you. Follow up through the chair. I think this is the benefit. So we basically have to start thinking long-term as both a council and administration. So when we meet, it's not a year-over-year request. It's what do we want to invest in over a longer period of time and make that decision today for the foreseeable future, which I support. I would actually prefer to see a longer-term budget process, 4 or 5 years at least. I think there would be a benefit to stretching over council terms, so there's continuity required based on this model. But I understand the 2-year model provides kind of a trial run of this process. Regarding the budgeting and mill rate, if we can only approve a mill rate annually, how do you construct a budget based on that? So you have a long-term forecast, but that budget necessarily includes mill rate increases. How do we balance that?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So that 2-year budget book would basically propose a mill rate for both the first year and the second year. So we would do the financial projections, both on expenditures and on revenues. We'd be able to project what type of a mill rate increase we thought we would need in that second year. And so the budget book would actually speak to what we anticipate the mill rate increase request of administration is in both years. However, just because of the legislation, council can only approve that first year formally, but in principle would be approving that second year. However, that actual formal approval could not occur until the second year.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for this work.
Councillor Hawkins, I see your microphone's unmuted now. Would you like to speak?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I strongly oppose this recommendation. And I want to set out the reasons why. And I'll have some questions for the administration. The first reason why I oppose this is because it relates to accountability. We're elected to do a job, and we're accountable to the elected for doing that job. At the top of the job priority list is our annual, and I stress the word operational budget. We're talking about operational budgets here. Before we raise taxes each year, the residents of Regina expect us to take a good, hard, root and branch look at the whole operational budget. We're expected to look across the board each year for efficiencies and for savings before we raise taxes. To reset priorities, and we're expected to reset priorities in light of current realities. It's not good enough to rely on last year's projections already out of date and skim by them without looking at the whole budget to make sure that taxpayers' money is being spent as efficiently and as carefully as possible before we ask for an increase in taxes. Residents are not looking for a budget process that bakes in tax increases over several years. I understand we're talking about approval in principle here, but I have difficulty understanding why approval in principle doesn't become binding. The financial officer is correct to say that some other cities, about 20 in the many other cities in Canada, have gone in this direction. But some of those cities have had heavy criticism as a result of their adoption of multi-year budgeting, including London, Ontario. I want to read 3 sentences from an editorial in the London, Ontario newspaper in 2019 at the time they were using multi-year budgeting. It says as follows: past councils gave annual budgets intense scrutiny, helped by a board of control whose key mandate was to oversee city spending. Board of Control has disappeared along with any inclination to dig deep and find savings. Today, annual budget updates on the multi-year plan resembles a drive-by audit. Few late nights are spent poring over spending plans. Members of council may conclude Londoners are apathetic about city spending because of poor turnout at recent public sessions, but To expect Londoners to engage when the tax horse has already left the barn is insulting. It's like saying we're in the final year of our multi-year budget with its predetermined tax increases, but why not come out anyway? I think that's exactly the problem. I think that this will reduce accountability. I share the opinion, whether it's in a multi-year budget book or not, as opposed to being in an actual budget, it's not good enough to do a kind of cursory drive-by audit in place of a proper annual operational budget analysis. We are properly held accountable each year for a proper budget, yearly budget, especially one that raises taxes. Multi-year budgeting compromises our democratic obligation to be accountable in that respect. Secondly, there's a practicality argument here that's being glossed over. This proposed plan will not really work. The exceptions, changes in the economy, changes in government, provincial government financing, other changes are so vast and unforeseen that in any event we'll end up doing, whether this program is adopted or not, we'll have to end up doing a serious review of the annual budget, regardless of any approval in principle of a previous year. I'll give you a specific example of recent history. In 2017, provincial government finances changed. We had to redo our budget. Again, in 2020, COVID, we've had to take a serious look at budget. So in the last 4 years, twice exceptions would have been invoked. And I'm going to suggest that in almost any year, exceptions will have to be invoked that will drive us back to annual budgeting, operational budgeting. There will always be something that will require us to look at the whole budget. Thirdly, and maybe most importantly in some ways, flexibility. Council can never give up the freedom to reset priorities at budget time in response to the needs of our residents without being met by the argument, oh, well, you gave some kind of conditional approval last year and now you want to change things. I don't think council should be obliged to address that argument. I don't think the onus should be on them to justify why they come at budget time with proposals that might not have been anticipated earlier. Even in the early life of this particular council that we're currently in, think of how often we as councillors have brought motions to the floor of this council chamber that necessitate unforeseen budget changes to be made as part of setting the annual operation budget. We need that flexibility to do the job that our residents sent us here to do. We have a budget system that works well. The proof is our last budget, which took account of new priorities, which found savings and efficiencies, and which did all of that with a record low tax increase. That's a budget system that's working. Why do we need a change, especially one that's going to be difficult to implement? And finally, Executive Committee in December 2015 debated this. The last council debated this in the recent past, and they said no, a clear no to multi-year budgeting. My question to Mr. Lacey is why, in light of that clear no, what has changed that causes you to invest this time in bringing this type of proposal back to council now?
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. So I'd say there's two primary reasons. First off, since this was last discussed at council, we've seen a significant number of more larger cities move to a multi-year budget process from when we looked at this a number of years ago. And so of the 20 larger cities that we looked at as an example, 17 are now using a multi-year budget approach. Many of them have moved to the multi-year budget approach in the last 5 years. So reason number one is just that we've seen, it seems that practice, and maybe it's debatable about whether that's best practice, but practice has been to move by many other cities to multi-year budgeting. And then the second piece is just with respect to internal conversations we've had about the OCP objective of long-term financial viability. And we do think there is significant value in just not talking about the annual budget, but also looking at budgets or what the finances on the operating side look like beyond a 1 year mark. That also allows more tying into strategic planning and longer term strategic planning, and I think potentially could allow for better discussions and linkages between the longer term financial plan and the annual operating budgets. And while I appreciate the comments around the fact that changes do happen in year and things happen, I would note that council, still at the end of the day, in that second year, has the opportunity to debate that budget and dive deeper into it if it so chooses and believe there are reasons necessary to do that.
Thank you very much. I want to reply to that and conclude. First of all, although you've listed 20 cities that have gone in this direction, 20 cities is not at all the majority of cities. I noticed that Toronto hasn't, St. John's, New Brunswick hasn't, Lethbridge hasn't, Victoria, BC hasn't. So I'm not sure that we can say there's a wide trend in this direction. And nor do I think that the verdict is in on whether it's been successful or not. Perhaps more substantively is your point that we need to do this to implement the OCP. I reject that argument. We can implement the OCP by considering our operational budget every year, and we've done that. I think that if the administration has concerns that we are deviating from the OCP, they can raise those concerns as we are debating the annual operation budget. So I do not accept that there's any need really to make this change. And I think in terms of our accountability to our electorate, our concern that the electorate will have when we start raising budgets and raising mill rates 2 years in a row without a root and branch look each year, our concern for practicality will be into endless arguments about whether the economy has changed or whether provincial budgeting has changed or whether some other change is significant. And concern for the flexibility of this council, for the ability of councillors to bring new items at budget time and have them considered without some kind of preconceived notion of what the mill rate increase will be. Those concerns cause me to have very serious doubts about the multi-year budgeting project in general, but about this one in particular. And I continue, as I did in 2015, to reject this approach. I urge councillors to be very cautious in this regard. I think that the citizens of Regina will have very deep concerns about us trying to raise mill rates 2 years in a row without considering that very deeply each time we do it. I'd ask you to reject this recommendation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Hawkins. Councillor Stadnichuk.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. I have a question through the chair. One of the arguments for doing this is that it would improve financial management and it would also save some resources. So if administration could explain exactly how this would save some financial resources and the time that is taken up in the budget process. I want to get kind of a better sense of how much that would be impacted by this process.
Yes, thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. So the savings that we're talking about really are about internal administrative processes. And so internally, part of what council doesn't see is when a budget's being prepared is we call it a call for budget. So basically every year what happens internally is that we do a call for budget, and that goes out to every area of the organization. And as part of that call, We ask the organization to basically assess what they believe their upcoming operating needs are for the future year, what the pressures might be, whether it's inflationary increases, whether it's utilization rate and the amount of services being provided, and as a result, because utilization's gone up, there might be a requirement for additional funding to service that increased utilization. What type of savings, what type of processes they've undertaken throughout the year that have resulted in savings in the budget, to identify those as well. And what new initiatives might be advanced if the opportunity presented itself to advance either council priorities or the OCP plan approved by council. Also, the same kind of questions are asked on the revenue side as well. So there's a significant amount of work not done just by the budget unit, but by the operational areas of the city, then to respond to that request. And so typically we give them 4 to 6 weeks to undertake that work and respond back to the internal budget unit. Then the internal budget unit, spends quite a bit of time then after that call comes in, seeking clarification, challenging assumptions, understanding what that call is. And from there's discussions at the executive level and the senior leadership level as well with respect to prioritization of the requests that come in. I'll be honest with you. Usually the amount of requests that we come in and the demand far exceeds, what we believe is the ability for the organization to basically approve or accept in the next year budget. So there's a lot of reiteration back and forth, prioritizing requests, and ultimately reaching decisions that we feel comfortable as administration proposing to council for approval as part of the actual budget document that you then see in the fall. So, we have never tracked the hours, but I do know that there is substantial resource requirement throughout the year by the operating areas to ensure that we can put that budget before council for approval. And so the savings, that we're envisioning from a internal time perspective is really about that intensive effort would still happen, but it would happen in the first year, and we'd be asking them to do work over both years. And so while there might be a little bit more work in that first year, we believe overall there will be a net savings with respect to not duplicating that then again in the second year of the process, which would then allow those operating areas to focus on operating type of priorities as opposed to focusing and responding to the budget call.
Thank you. Through the chair, so if we did move to a 2-year budget, in the second year, would council be prevented from bringing forward motions that would impact the budget? How would a motion for significant spending be dealt with in this 2-year budget?
So, I come back to council always has the ability to bring forward motions and change the budget. It even happens now when we approve an annual budget. Sometimes council will come forward with an in-year initiative that wasn't in the budget. Part of that discussion then has to be how do we fund that, and sometimes that's taken from reserves, or if we are seeing savings in a particular part of the budget, funds can be reallocated. That happens now. And so I guess what I would say is in a multi-year budget process, that ability is not taken away from council to be able to do that. I mean, I think overall, we'd be hopeful that with a multi-year budget process that we're looking at larger substantial changes. That's kind of the intent. But at the end of the day, if council believes there's an important thing that has come up that has not been covered either in the existing year budget or in the future second year budget, council certainly has the ability to advance motions and approve them.
Thank you for that. Through the chair, some of the cities that are mentioned and that are referred to in the appendices, some have a 5-year budget, and you're recommending 2 years. Could you explain sort of when you were reviewing this, why you chose 2 years over a longer period?
So primarily for two reasons why we've made this recommendation. First off, the further you go out, the more assumptions that you're making, and the more likelihood that there might be some significant events that happen, or that your assumptions are incorrect, and incorrect to an extent that it's significant and requires adjustments in the budget. I do think you see some cities like Calgary recognize that, and so in kind of the mid-year, so after the second year and that third year, they do more of a deeper dive to make changes to their budget to compensate for that. But the number one reason for us was that looking out further could result in greater changes happening in out years because assumptions were not correct, or things happened in the environment that required more changes than hopefully limiting the number of changes. The second reason is, to be honest, is this would be the first time we're doing it. I think there's going to be probably quite a few lessons learned if council approves this through the first multi-year budget process. And so I think 2 years reduces risk with respect to ensuring that we can put together a good 2-year budget as opposed to a 4 or 5 year budget that I think would have more risk to it, especially when it's the first time doing it. And I would just note that in the recommendations, because of that, we're recommending that after 2 years we come back and kind of do a lessons learned with council, and that I think would provide an opportunity then to talk about, does it make sense to move to a broader or longer term budget. My understanding is when Saskatoon Council debated this 2 or 3 years ago, initially they were talking about a 4-year budget as well. And at the end of the day, for the reasons I just articulated, given it was their first year, they went with a 2-year budget. I do note they're going with a 2-year budget again, but that is a decision of council, but those are the reasons why we're recommending 2 years.
Okay, thank you. I have no further questions.
Thanks, Councillor Stanichuk. Councillor Shaw.
I just kind of want to add a comment and some clarification through the chair. I know when I was campaigning, I heard this numerous times at the doorstep. Why don't you have multi-year budgeting? Why? So I know I looked into it before, and I'm happy to see that it's on the table now and we're discussing it and putting it to vote. So I'm happy about that. I'm congratulating for that. No, my question though is, so we're doing the 2-year, and you just explained that to Councillor Stanichuk. If this is successful, will we go to a longer term through the chair? Is there potential?
Yeah, through you, Madam Chair, I would say that is a decision point that we should discuss and make before we do the next multi-year budget phase. Okay. So before we do the 2025 and future budget, right, that we bring a report forward and have that conversation at that point in time.
So what I'm asking then, yes, thank you. So we'll do this for 2 years, and then after that 2 years, it'll say, you know what, that worked. There is potential for us to go into more of a 4 and 5. That's what I'd like to know through the chair. That's
through you, Mr. Chair. That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for that.
Thanks, Councillor Shaw. Councillor Bershiani.
Thank you, through the chair. So how would we go about educating the residents around this multi-year? So what would be the steps forward to consider how we're going to do engagement? Because I think that is key. I think there's another key piece that Saskatoon did, and they actually did their engagement strategy through that and utilized the word, almost like a pilot project, as you said, Mr. Lacey, through just for the first 2 years. So just what would be, is there a strategy that we would be engaging residents initially on the first year, or is it going to be also in the second year, or how do you see that happening, through the chair?
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. So I think what we've seen happen in other cities, and what we would look at following and developing a communication strategy and an engagement strategy around, is in that first year of the multi-year budget, or leading into the multi-year budget decision making. There is significant consultation with the community around the development of that budget, and so you would typically see more, I think even more consultation than what we even do in our current annual year budget process. So I would envision that our plan, which would be part of what we would develop if this was approved by council, would be a significant engagement strategy in that first year of the budget cycle. In subsequent years, in this case it would be the second year, that there would still be engagement with the community, but I don't think it would be at the same level. Is not what we envision, and I don't think it's necessarily what you see in other communities as well. But there still would be more. There still would be an engagement and a communication strategy, but it would focus more on what is in the budget and what the money's being spent on, and what type of initiatives or new initiatives might be advanced, particularly in that second year.
Okay, thank you. I agree that I think the multi-year, it's almost a business plan, and I think it does aid in the process for budgeting. And I think there is a piece that does work for in planning for the city. I mean, yes, you can do it year to year, but it's hard to plan that way. So I think the 2-year is a good start. But I'm just wondering, you've indicated that it would come back for council's, I guess, discussion as to the pros and the cons and what we've learned. So I think, would it be something that we would be putting out to the public as well as we talk about the 2-year, I guess, budgeting, that this would be, I don't know if you want to call it a pilot, so they understand that there is going to be looked at after the 2 years? Is that something that could be considered through the chair?
Through you, Madam Chair. So, Mr. Chair, through you, Mr. Chair. So, maybe just a couple of comments there. So, I think number one, as part of that first year engagement strategy, there would need to be a little bit of an education component as well about the fact that we are moving to a multi-year strategy, and so I think that would be key in that engagement piece. I'll be honest, I haven't thought that far ahead with respect to when we come back after 2 years and kind of do a lessons learned and seek council's perspective and advice about the next multi-year budget cycle, what that would look like, about how we would engage the community around that piece. But I certainly think there would be that opportunity to after 2 years as well, do some type of engagement as well to seek that kind of broader public input, citizen input into it. I haven't thought that far, but I think that could be something certainly that would be reasonable to do. Okay,
great, thank you. I think just the last question was in regards to the term and how it would fall within council. So we would want to make sure that it would fall within the term, so the 2 years would work with the election term, so we're not proposing a budget on a new term. Is that accurate through the chair?
So with the multi-year budget being proposed here, it would fall, so that second year would be 2024, which would be the last year of this council's cycle. I think that's part of the piece when we come back after 2 years, is to have a conversation about whether you want the budget to go over a council's term. So what's being proposed here, it doesn't go over a council's term. It's interesting in the cities that we did look at, many of them, however, do go over a council term, at least the first year. And I'm speculating that's in part because the new council needs time to decide on what its priorities are, etc. I think to some extent for us that's mitigated a little bit because we have historically delayed the budget approval into the next year to give a new council some time. So I'm making it a long answer. I think the short answer is what's being proposed here is it does not go over a council's term, this council's term. I think that if council wishes to continue doing multi-year budgeting after the first 2 years, we should talk about that. Probably should be a conversation point about, does it make sense not to lap a council term, or should we look at a process that does?
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I support this.
Thanks, Councillor Bershani. Councillor LeBlanc.
Yes, thank you. I'm in favor of the recommendation. I just want to add one comment for the reason why I'm in favor of it that hasn't been mentioned yet, and that's just with respect to nonprofit organizations that rely in part on our funding. So I know in a typical year when it comes around to November and they don't know what kind of funding they're going to have in January, that makes it very difficult to plan not only capital and improvements, but also in terms of staffing. And so I think those organizations that rely on us for funding will be able to do better work for us with more predictable, stable funding. So I'm in favor of the recommendation for that reason and the others mentioned. Thanks.
Mayor Masters.
Thank you, through you, Deputy Mayor. Mr. Lacey, could you give a rough estimate of the percentage of the budget that is for legislative services, sewer, water, roads, the things that we are legislatively required to provide to the citizens of Regina?
Through you, Mayor Masters, so I don't have a specific number, but it would be a significant percentage of the overall budget would be going towards those type of services that cities are mandated to provide.
So am I okay using 75%? If I said 75% of the budget is always going to things that we are legislated, or is it higher than that?
Through you, Mayor Masters, it's interesting. I've never looked at it that way, but I would certainly say it probably exceeds 50%. The utility budget alone is a mandated service as an example, and if you look at our overall budget, that alone is a third of our overall spend as just utilities, water alone.
Okay, in terms of the percentage of the overall budget, you've been here for a few years now. What's the largest variance year to year? Have we ever had one of those big departments, Pickett Water, go up by 10% in a budget year?
Through you, Mayor Masters, no, what I would call the day-to-day business of the organization, the business as usual, typically those increases are, really do track on what are your salary increases with respect to, and that's a big component, 50% of the budget, salary increases, and so that's dictated by the collective agreements, and typically over the last couple of years those have been running 1 or 2%, and then you have CPI increases. So I'd say for business as usual, the budget really is pretty predictable with respect to what you project out and doesn't change a lot. Where you do see bigger changes is when we advance a new initiative or additional infrastructure is added to the organization. For example, if we add a new fire hall as an example, well, now you have to operationalize that, and there's additional staff to staff the fire hall. That's typically when you see some bigger additions to the budget that are initiative specific.
That's actually an excellent point. Thank you. Through you, Deputy Mayor, using your example of the fire hall, would that just all of a sudden appear in 2021, or would we have some lead time, you have some lead time in understanding what's needed and when it's needed, regardless of whether we have multi-year budgeting or not?
So thank you for the question through you, Mr. Chair. So, in things like that, typically there's significant foreshadowing of that expenditure. A lot of times that comes through a master plan, or a master plan will look outwards 10 plus years and indicate what the needs might be. And then that is followed up by, particularly in the capital side, the 5-year capital plan. And for something like that, you would see that pop out 4 or 5 years out on that plan, and then as each year passed, it would come closer and closer to realization and in the current year capital plan.
So OCP are all of our master plans, some of which are currently being worked on, are all long-term.
That is correct.
So I'm just going to make a statement as it relates to, with greatest respect, I am going to agree to disagree with my colleague, Councillor Hawkins. I do not believe that planning and behavior of council is mutually exclusive. It is not mutually exclusive. Our obligation for efficiency and sound allocation of taxpayer dollars is always in effect, regardless of a budget process. Long-term, multi-year budgeting, ensures sustainability of assets and services, and helps us gain a longer-term focus. And I'll pick up on what both Councillor Stevens was alluding to in terms of that predictability, as well as Councillor LeBlanc and not-for-profits, is adding in the benefit for some of the organizations that receive funding from us for that greater certainty allows us to achieve our objectives. If I think of the Community Safety and Wellbeing Plan, I think of the Sustainability Framework. We already do a capital plan for 5 years. We have a transit master plan coming down. These are all long-term initiatives that we're looking to implement. To think of them in one-year budget terms, frankly, I think is a disservice to that strategic priorities that we're looking to enact. And in fact, their successful completion of these priorities requires a longer-term vision than any given budget year. And I will go back that every year we'll be looking and digging in, regardless if there's 2-year planning, we're still going to have to dig into those budgets on a year-by-year basis. That is our obligation, and it doesn't go away because we're allowing our administration to utilize their time more effectively and our knowledge of what's coming down the pike more effectively. I believe the multi-year budget framework for current fiscal policy decisions allow the short-term decisions are compatible with our longer-term plans. And so clearly I'll be in favor of this. Thank you, Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor Masters. Councillor Shaw.
Just to kind of add to Mayor Masters' point, I looked at this a lot before I was elected, and I seen the benefits along with a lot of people that I talked to within my residence and my ward. I always relate back to a business plan or a vision. We don't make a business plan for a year. We have a vision, and I understand how the city works that, yeah, okay, we want this or we want that. But this will add a more concrete, this is what we're going to do in the next 2 years. Everything gets adjusted according to things, how it happens. It's not that we as council can't bring it back and say, hey, this needs to be adjusted. Nowhere will this business plan for 2 years say we can't come back and say, oh, something happened. So I want to make that very clear to the residents that this is so beneficial for us having that vision and having that hope and dream of where we can move forward. And nobody makes up a business plan for 1 year. It's always 5 to 10 years. And so we as a city administration and we as city councils, we need to lead by example. And this is so beneficial to the residents of Regina. I do want to have on record, though, many people that don't understand and see what we see in the inside stuff, going on with Councillor Brasciani's recommendation, we need that one pager to give to the people of Regina to say the benefits, because once they see it in black and white that, oh, administration is less, 6 weeks less, and this, I really want to stress that. And at least for now, when we approve this, or if this gets approved, and then when we go back to it in 2 years, put this out to the residents and say, hey, considering what we just did for the last 2 years, do you see the benefit? That public engagement, them knowing the savings that they're going to see and the value added is it's detrimental it's so instrumental in the success of this moving forward, and for them to see what we see on the inside. So I'd like that on record, and I would really like to, I appreciate the fact of this coming forward and this being such a benefit to the residents and to us in Regina. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Councillor Shaw. Councillor Skiniak.
Thanks. I just have a question about the timing of master plans. So I'm just curious if we approve the implementation of 2-year or multi-year budget, is it anticipated that this will have any impact on how the timing of when master plans are developed as a result?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I don't anticipate that moving to a multi-year budget will have any impact on the timing of the development or updating of current master plans. As those master plans are updated and come to council for approval, once approved, if there's any changes in those master plans, or if it's a new master plan that's identifying new needs, that would just be incorporated then into the budget process. It serves as an input into the budget process, those master plans.
I just wanted to confirm that. Thank you.
you, Councillors Kiniak. I see no other speakers on the list. I guess with that, I'll have my own comments. I think multi-year budgeting is good. And now we'll call the vote. Mr. Clerk?
I just need a... That's all I need to be said. Thank
Short
you.
and sweet.
Thank you. I'll begin with Councillor Stevens, please.
In favor.
Councillor Bresciani.
In favor.
Councillor Findura.
In favor.
Councillor LeBlanc.
In favor.
Councillor Shaw.
In favor.
Councillor Zahidniak.
In favor.
Councillor Stadnichuk.
In favor.
Councillor Hawkins.
Opposed.
Mayor Masters.
In favor.
Councillor Mancinelli.
In favor.
Carries 9-1, Deputy Mayor.
Okay, next up, we'll now consider EF 21-50, Economic and Preliminary 2022 Budget Development Update. I think I'll be asking Mr. Lacey from... I guess Mr. Holden to open up on this one.
Thank you, and through the chair. So just following the conversation we just had about multi-year budgeting, now we're going to have the conversation about preliminary 2022 budget development, which obviously will be an annual one-year budget. So we're here before Exec Committee to provide an economic update and a preliminary high-level review of the 2022 budget. This is an information piece, and we're going to, at the end, we'll welcome any questions that you may have. It's really important that there are no decisions being made today by council, but this is an important opportunity to share information with yourself and, of course, share information with the public. So today's presentation will provide a summary of the economic environment as context for the 2022 budget development, factors that influence the official committee plan's priority of long-term financial viability, a preliminary review of the 2022 budget development, and of course the various factors that the administration will be considering as we develop the budget, along with an overview of our budget timelines for 2022. And at this point, I'll turn the presentation over to Mr. Lacey, and he'll walk us through that economic environment under which our 2022 budget will be developed. And of course, there's quite a bit of information that it's important for you to hear and for residents of Regina to hear. So I'll turn it over to Mr. Lacey.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. So having awareness of the economic environment in which the budget is developed is important, as it's an indicator of city growth, the need for and capacity of the city to expand or add new services, and provides context in the development of the budget that's affordable to the residents of Regina. The 22 budget is again being developed under unprecedented circumstances. COVID has been a major disruptor. Life in cities across the country have been significantly altered by the pandemic and the measures imposed to contain it. Having said that, there is light at the end of the tunnel with the further lifting of health restrictions on July 11th, which should assist in the further recovery of the economy and see the return of many pre-COVID activities that we've not seen since the pandemic began. A resilient economy fosters dynamic businesses and sustainable employment, and it helps to attract and retain professionals, families, and individuals to our city. When developing the budget, administration considers global, regional, and economic factors. Understanding these constantly changing factors allows the city to manage near-term risks and uncertainties while also planning for a long-term financial resilience and sustainability. This slide depicts the historic and forecasted GDP growth for the province, the city, and Canada. The shaded area identifies forecast data with predictions as of March 31st, 2021, and these predictions are taken from the Conference Board of Canada and may change as we continue to see the pandemic and the impacts of the pandemic evolve. Regina's GDP declined by 3.4% in 2020 due to COVID-19, but the drop was less severe than the rest of the province and Canada, and that's in part thanks to the large unstable public service that we have here, public sector that we have here in the city. Looking outward, it's more on the brighter side. The Conference Board of Canada is predicting that recovery from the effects of the pandemic will boost Regina's GDP by 4.9% in 2021 and a further 4.1% in 2022, higher than the 10-year average Regina has seen of 2.3%, and slightly outpacing Saskatchewan's 4.8% growth forecast in 2021 and 3.5% in 2022. In dollar terms, the economic predictions show that Canada is expected to return to basically the same size economy as pre-COVID at the end of 2021, which might be interpreted as getting back to a normal or new near normal. Therefore, while we're seeing this expected growth, big positive growth in the GDP, it just really is getting us back to what pre-COVID GDP looked like. From a budget perspective, overall, city economic activity will be modest, resulting in slower growth in the utilization of city services than what we saw earlier in the decade. Potentially less willingness or ability for residents and businesses to absorb cost increases, including taxes. That's kind of the affordability conversation. And less natural revenue growth from taxation revenue. So revenue growth without increase in the mill rate. This chart shows the value of building permits over the last 10 years. So the 10-year average from 2011 to 2020 is $568 million, which is represented by that black horizontal line. And as you can see, building permits have declined from the 2012 peak, and the value of 2018, 2019, and 2020 permits were below the 5-year average, with 2020 being the lowest in the last 10 years. So what we are seeing from this is an indicator that economic growth and building construction activity in particular has slowed over the last 5 years. And given that general correlation between building permits and natural tax growth, that's, again, tax growth without seeing a mill rate increase, we expect to see lower growth in tax revenues, basically due to the natural tax growth in the property tax base as we look into 2022. That natural tax growth has usually been about an increase of $2 to $4 million annually, and because we're seeing these lower values, we expect natural tax growth will be on that lower end of that range of $2 million. The Conference Board of Canada is also forecasting a lower than average inflationary increase of 1.5% in 2021, and it's anticipated that inflation will increase to 2% for 2022 and future years. And to put that in perspective, the 10-year Regina average has been about 1.8% over those 10 years. The relationship to budget development is that CPI impacts or increases the cost of the city's non-salary expenses. Also, a higher inflationary rate could spur increases in borrowing rates, et cetera, if that were to occur. So that's why we pay attention to this indicator. In 2019, the city's unemployment rate dropped to 5.1% from 6% the year before. According to Conference Board of Canada, Regina's unemployment rate was at a historic high of 8.1% in 2020 due to the pandemic. And while the labor market is expected to improve, the Conference Board predicts that Regina's unemployment rate is expected to increase further to 10% in 2021 and then drop back to 8.4% in 2022. Again, that's in comparison to Regina's 10-year average of 4.8% represented by that horizontal line. And really from a budgetary perspective, higher than average unemployment can signal the ability of citizens to pay for services, and is also can be a signal of the economy. And in a lower than average unemployment rate, what that does is that increases competition for skilled workers and increases cost pressures on the city overall. So in summary, the economic environment in which the 2022 budget will be developed is impacted by the pandemic, but we expect that financial impact to be less than 2021. Even as the city and the province continue to reopen, the effects of the pandemic on the economy will likely endure until full economic recovery takes place. And all of these factors impact the city's operations, but also impact residents and businesses' view of affordability. Finally, while the economic environment must be considered as the budget is developed, we also must be mindful of how decisions of today impact the future and long-term financial viability. And so maybe at this point I would just pause before I kind of get into the rest of the presentation that talks about long-term financial viability and preliminary budget information. If there's any questions with respect to the presentation to date. If not, Mr. Chair, I'll just continue on.
I'm just going to pause the whole meeting for a second. We're due for a break at 11:15. This seems like a natural spot for a break right now if everyone's in agreement. Okay, maybe we'll take a 15-minute break right now and we'll regroup at 25 after 11. When we left off, Mr. Lacey had just finished giving us a presentation. He was opening up for questions. If I could get someone to move the report, we should do that as we start up again. Councillor Shaw. And as I was saying, I think Mr. Lacey was finished with his presentation, opening up for questions. If any councillor had questions.
Mr. Chair, I have a question.
Oh, 1 second. Mr. Lacey wanted to say something.
No, through you, Mr. Chair. So I do have another part of the presentation to complete, but I thought now would be a good time to pause before I moved into the next part of the presentation.
And Amber, you were saying? Yeah, Councillor Hawkins. Okay. Councillor Hawkins, please go ahead.
Very briefly, I'm surprised at the unemployment figure numbers. Does that unemployment take into account the kind of recent activity that we're talking about with respect to canola crushing and those other major projects?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So that is an excellent question. When we reviewed these results from the conference board, we too were surprised by the amount of the unemployment rate, and we're currently trying to follow up to determine why they have that so high, particularly at the 10% level in 2021 and future years. So I don't have specific information currently about why we're higher. This is what they're projecting. And I would suspect some of the employment numbers with respect to some of the large projects that are currently being contemplated may not be reflected in that number.
Thank you. That's a helpful answer. And another very brief question. You posted the consumer price index inflation figures. Traditionally, municipal inflation has been a little higher than the consumer price index. Do your calculations take into account the normally higher municipal inflation rate?
Thank you for the question. We do also track and look at what we call kind of the municipal inflation rate index. And that sometimes, particularly in years when you see a lot of construction activity, does become significantly higher than what the general CPI rate is. And that is in part because of higher demand for construction. And so we've got significant capital plans so that there is that correlation. So we haven't done that work for the current year yet. Over the last couple of years, it's been pretty consistent with CPI. But if you go back earlier in the decade, that is correct, Councillor Hawkins. The municipal rate was significantly higher because of all the construction activity that was being undertaken.
Thank you very much for the very helpful answers.
Thank you, Councillor Hawkins. Councillor Zakidniak.
Thank you. So my questions are building on or similar to Councillor Hawkins. I just wanted to know generally if we wanted some additional information about the recent past and predicted future trends for our city, province, or country, where could we find that information? So just additional information about how they came up with those projections. Is there a source for more information?
So we have been typically using the Conference Board of Canada for most of this data. So if there was specific information the councillor was looking for, I would suggest that perhaps give me a call or send me an email, and we will do our best to follow up and try to find that information for you.
Okay, if there's, is there some additional information available on a website anywhere, just for us to do some preliminary research on of our own?
So through you, Mr. Chair, I know the Conference Board of Canada piece, you need to pay for that piece. So through our strategy department, we have access to that information because they paid a subscription for that service. So once again, I'm not sure what that what the contract language is around that, but certainly we can work with our strategy branch if there is specific information you were looking in to see if we can, if the Conference Board has that, and we can provide that to you through our strategy branch.
Okay, understand. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Zakinyak. Mayor Masters.
Thank you. Through you, Deputy Mayor. Building upon Councillor Hawkins' question, there was the forecasting for GDP as well. Just to clarify, that doesn't include some of the current projects being contemplated when we're looking at that kind of steady at 2% in the future over the course of 2022 to 2025?
Through you, Mayor Masters, once again, I can't say definitively whether it's not included. I am suspecting because those projects, have not been formally approved and construction has started yet, I do not believe that they would be in this forecast.
Thank you for that. The other slide you were showing was the number of permits relative to Ford. Yes, thank you. This is dollar value, not number of permits. Is that correct?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think that's an important distinction here, is that this is the dollar value of construction being undertaken with respect to the permits that have been issued. The actual number of permits has not really changed. In fact, it, I believe, has increased slightly. So this is dollar value of construction. So the size of construction projects that happen in any particular year can really drive those numbers. So if you look in the earlier part of the decade, we were building Mosaic Stadium as an example. That was a significant infrastructure project, and that would have really driven up some of those dollar values earlier in this graph that you're seeing here.
Thank you. And then finally, looking at this, the building permits 2011 to 2021, and kind of if you were to plot this out in terms of a line diagram, going back to the unemployment rate, do you believe there could be a correlation between the unemployment rate historically here and a linkage through to building permits being put out?
So from a dollar value perspective, again, not a permit perspective, really, this is really an indication of how much construction activity is being undertaken. If you have a lot of construction activity from a dollar value perspective, you have a lot of construction workers that are working. So there would be a correlation between employment rates, particularly construction employment, which is always a big factor when you look at the overall employment numbers. So construction jobs would tend to follow what you see in the amount of construction activity that's happening, which is really indicated by the dollar value of that investment that's being made.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's it.
Thank you. I see no further questions, and I believe we have a presentation to continue with.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm just going to continue on. I'll find that slide. So I just want to talk just a little bit about long-term financial viability. I just have a couple of slides on it. I think it's important not to forget about long-term financial viability, even though we're looking at the budget just in the upcoming year. So as I mentioned previously in our multi-year budget discussion, long-term financial viability is a community priority in the official community plan, the OCP. And this community priority, really serves to remind us that while the focus of today is going to be on the is on COVID-19 pandemic emergency and its impact on the short and medium term, as we develop the 2022 budget, we really need to be mindful of the long term. And so before returning to the 2022 budget, I just want to touch on a number of things. So there's many factors that need to be considered to ensure we collectively achieve long-term financial viability. Achieving the end goal of long-term financial viability is a complex process. It requires the integration of many different pieces, from revenues and expenses to master plans to sustainability and innovation, and sorting all those on how they connect into the economic environment we just talked about. And like many pieces of a puzzle, it takes time. If another factor gets introduced or something changes in the environment, the pieces of the puzzle need to be reworked and reintegrated again. And with that, I just want to touch on some of the factors we believe will be significant as we develop the 2022 budget that we need to be mindful of with respect to long-term financial viability. So first of all, the economy, as we've just discussed. The economy impacts the decisions that are made in preparing a budget and the pace at which the OCP and related plans can be advanced. The economic conditions under which the 2022 budget is being developed have changed greatly over the last year due to COVID and will continue to change through the rest of this year and into 2022. Levels of service. Decisions around levels of service, including increasing or decreasing them, are tied to objectives outlined in the city's master plans and OCP and the ability to fund them. Revenues and expenses. The reality is increasing costs generally exceed natural revenue growth in a municipal government. That's just not unique to our municipality. This places pressure on achieving long-term financial viability. Debt and reserves. The level of a city's reserves and debt are also important components to long-term financial viability. While there is room in the city's debt limit to consider the strategic use of debt, there are also many potential projects that may require debt, and thus these projects will have to be prioritized as there's not sufficient debt room to fund them all. Also, the general fund reserve, a key reserve which provides council the most flexibility. The uncommitted balance of that reserve going into 2022 is near its minimum recommended fund level. And finally, capital investments. One of the biggest long-term financial viability challenges facing municipalities, including our city, is infrastructure investment. Capital investments contribute to a growing city, while they are also required to maintain, renew, and replace aging infrastructure. So the thought I would like to leave with you as we turn our focus to the development of the 2022 budget is that we must balance both the short-term and long-term in our budgetary decision-making. Today's decisions can also impact the future and how the pieces of the puzzle come together. And Regina City Council, as Regina City Council, you play a critical role in that process. So in pulling the pieces of that puzzle together, we're using a number of tools and taking a number of actions to rise to that challenge. We must continue to invest in infrastructure to address our infrastructure deficit. For the last decade, we have been increasing the transfer of funding from the operating budget to the capital budget by 3% annually. As well, recent past council decisions have placed dedicated mill rate increases targeted at specific aspects of our infrastructure. So currently we have a 5-year 0.5% dedicated mill rate increase to increase investment in recreational infrastructure. And previously we had a 1% per year mill rate increase for 5 years, which dedicated funding towards our residential road renewal program. We continue to develop and refine our long-range financial model that provides information to better understand how financial decisions today impact the city's financial future. We work to refine and improve the city's asset management program, which provides administration and council a more holistic view of assets to make informed decisions focused on community priorities. Good asset management looks at more than just capital and operating costs of an asset. It also considers how those assets support the delivery of services to residents. And over the last 4 years, administration has achieved over $20 million in savings through innovation and efficiency, but we must continue to challenge ourselves to be innovative and look for ways to do things differently while still providing effective service. And the current council-led efficiency review is another example of work being undertaken by the city to improve process and become more efficient. And we must also work to ensure that we have a solid policy and process that identifies when the city should be recovering its costs of providing a service, including the cost recovery is whether it's directly from the user at 100% or at some portion thereof. And another final tool is property taxes, which account for over half of total revenues and are the primary source of revenue for the city. So with that, I would like to turn and discuss the 2022 preliminary budget development and where we're currently at and where we're going. So as I had mentioned previously, the 2022 budget process has begun at the city. Administration has undertaken some preliminary work to determine where we believe the most significant opportunities and challenges exist with respect to 2022 general fund revenues and expenses. Work will continue between now and the fall to refine and develop a 2022 budget for Council's consideration later this year. The future course of COVID-19 is obviously difficult to predict. The pace of economic activity is expected to increase gradually throughout 2021 and 2022. City administration is continuously monitoring the COVID financial impact, but we do expect 2022 to be less impacted by the pandemic than 2021. And I think by the fall we'll have a better sense of what that impact will be as it relates to the city's finances once the current public health orders are lifted. So it's important to note that the figures I'll be talking about in the next few slides are still early estimates and may change, but they are important figures for council members to be aware of as administration begins to develop budget development for 2022, as it illustrates the starting point in the development of that budget. And I'd also like to call this kind of the status quo budget, or what the status quo numbers are if nothing were to change. There would be no service level changes, no key initiatives other than what council's previously approved. What would the budget look like if everything stayed static? So on the revenue side of the budget, we anticipate the most significant changes in revenue to be, first off, a decrease in the municipal revenue sharing grant the city receives from the province, which represents a portion of the PST the province has collected in previous years. The city's 2022 municipal revenue sharing grant is calculated, again, based on a percentage of PST revenues collected in 2020, 2021 by the province. And due to COVID-19, the audited year-end financial results of the province shows a decrease of 5% in actual PST revenue collected in those years. So based on that, we're projecting a decrease in our municipal revenue sharing grant of approximately 2.1 million, or basically a 5% decrease compared to the 2021 budget. With respect to property taxes, we expect to see natural property tax growth, and that's growth not related to any mill rate increases, of approximately 2.8 million. We are projecting to see a one-time increase in investment income of 2.5 million. And this is really coming from the full implementation of the new investment policy approved by council earlier this year. And due to a more diverse asset mix, we expect to see an increase in investment income in our portfolio. While there are many changes in other revenues like user fees, they're not expected to be significant for 2021. So overall, city revenues are projected to only increase by 3.8 million in 2022. Excluding any increase in the mill rate and also excluding any potential impacts COVID might have on our revenues in 2022. So for example, at this time, we've not projected the impact COVID might have on transit fee revenue. And so for the purpose of this analysis, we've assumed a return to near normal levels that existed prior to the pandemic. And I think in the fall, we'll have a better sense about what we expect and what we'll be seeing with city revenues that have been impacted by the pandemic and what we think their impacts will be in 2022. On the expense side, assuming a base or status quo operation, key pressures include increases in the cost of salaries and related benefits, including the mandatory increase in CPP premiums, as well as increase in salaries due to job evaluation ratings initiative. And salary and benefit expenditures, therefore, are expected to increase by nearly 4 million. For non-salary cost pressures, administration has set an objective for itself that any increase in the cost of goods and services due to CP will be absorbed within the existing budget. However, even with absorbing these increased costs, there are a number of unfunded pressures facing the city, including the impact of the carbon tax. As part of the federal government's previously announced plan, the carbon tax will increase by 25% in 2022, and that is expected to have a direct impact on the budget of about $500,000. And we'll be continuing to monitor and analyze the price of fuel and gas, electricity, and that carbon tax over the coming months and further refine that estimate. Increase in the contributions to capital from the operating budget by approximately 1.7 to continue our goal of increasing this line item by 3% annually to help address the infrastructure deficits that I spoke to previously. And then finally, increased operating costs associated with capital projects, including the upgrade to our financial systems, installation of IT infrastructure, and enhanced traffic controls that carry on into the next fiscal year, totaling $500,000. So in total, this increased cost equals approximately $6.6 million. If you compare that to our projected revenue increase of $3.8 million I've spoke to in the previous slide, we have a preliminary funding gap of $2.8 million in 2022 as it relates to civic operations. And $2.8 million, I often like to frame things from a mill rate perspective as well. I think it kind of gives a sense of what that impact is. That's approximately a 1% mill rate increase. 2.8 million is just a little over a 1% mill rate increase. In addition to that $2.8 million funding gap, we have two dedicated mill rate increases committed to by council. We have the 0.45% related to the stadium and 0.5% related to the recreational infrastructure program. And so from a dollar value perspective, these two dedicated mill rate increases represent about $2.6 million. Also, items have been approved by council to date that will impact the 2022 budget, and they include $0.5 million for the harm reduction and social determinants initiative that was approved in last year's budget and was funded out of one-time funds, but we need to find ongoing funds as we move into 2022. $0.42 million has been approved by council related to the winter city strategy response. $370,000 for drainage and lot grading regulations, and those total $1.3 million. So these, in total, when you look at the council initiatives or approved items to date, equal an additional $3.9 million. And finally, through the housing incentive policy, council invests approximately $2.5 million each year into that program. HIP has had no dedicated funding source since its inception and has historically been funded through reserves or a reallocation of funds from other areas within the city budget. And so as a result, once again, we'll need to identify a funding source for HIP in the 2022 budget. I would mention, however, in a recent council update on HIP, administration specified that it would be bringing a strategy back to council, including a dedicated mill rate discussion that would provide a process by which HIP would have an ongoing funding source moving forward. And so I anticipate we'll do that as part of the 2022 budget when we bring that forward. But having said that, overall, that leaves us with a $9.2 million civic operations funding gap, which is equivalent to about a 3.4% mill rate increase. So the previous slide summarized what we know today with respect to the 2022 budget. But as we continue to develop the 2022 budget, there are a number of items that we will continue to analyze, develop, and refine over the coming months that potentially will further impact next year's budget. And so they include, as I've mentioned previously, the forecasted impact on city finances in 2022. We've already captured the $2.5 million reduction in the municipal revenue sharing grant. However, as I mentioned, there's potential to be other impacts in transit and recreational revenue should historic trends in the use of those services not return to normal quickly in 2022. As well, any impacts due to the Regina Police budget, which is independently developed by the Regina Police Service and approved by the Regina Service Police Commission, is not yet reflected in these numbers. Any financial impacts or initiatives developed for implementation in 2022 to advance the OCP or council priorities, and any other pressures that are identified through the development of the 2022 budget. And finally, any efficiency savings identified as part of the efficiency review currently underway. It's not known at this time whether those savings, when identified, will be captured in the 2022 budget, so they're not currently reflected in the numbers I've provided. So the preliminary outlook for 2022 shows a significant gap between expenses and revenues in 2022 that will need to be addressed through the budget, the remaining budget development process. And as I mentioned before, I think this trend is shared by many municipalities, just not us, and will require the use of one or more of the following options to close that gap. Efficiencies and savings through process improvements and looking at new and innovative ways of work. The city's business is service delivery, Regina has a history of examining our services to ensure that we are being delivered as efficiently and effectively as possible. Implementing cost containment strategies have been a key priority of the city and as part of our annual planning and budget processes. These cost savings have been largely achieved without major impacts on service levels, and as I previously mentioned, the city has undertaken an efficiency review in 2021 led by council. Revenue increases and use of reserves. Regina, like many other Canadian cities, offers a broad range of services but has limited revenue sources, with property taxes being the largest revenue source. In addition to identifying revenue increases, administration will also be analyzing the use of reserves to address budgetary gaps. Reserves are a one-time funding source, and a balance needs to be maintained to respond to future events. However, possible uses of reserves that we'll be considering in 2022 is to fund the reduction in the municipal revenue sharing grant through use of reserves, and also continue to use reserves to fund at least part of the HIP deficit as we look at a longer-term strategy to ensure that that program has a full-time ongoing funding source. And finally, administration analyzes service levels to find opportunities to address fiscal gaps through adjustments to service levels. And so while there is a number of unknowns, currently I am anticipating that kind of the initial mill rate increase could be in the range of approximately 5%. But once again, this is based on preliminary information, and there's significant work yet to occur between now and when we bring a proposed budget forward to council. So next I will turn your attention to the utility budget. So the utility budget supports our water, wastewater, and drainage systems, which are often the highest value assets of any municipality. And the utility fund operates on a 25-year fully funded planning model, and it's a user-pay system that operates on a full cost recovery basis. Past council decisions have placed the utility fund in a long-term financially sustainable position. As part of the 2019 utility operating budget, administration proposed and council approved a 3% utility rate increase for each of the 3 years of 2019, 2020, and 2021. Each year, as part of that annual budget approval process, council had the ability to review the utility rate increase for that year. As we look to 2022, you may recall that on May 26th, council considered a report on the utility lead service connection program. And in that report, it was noted that the utility model base case projection was that there was projecting a 3% rate increase in each year as well in 2022 through to 2024 to meet the objectives of the utility. And this base rate increase is in addition to the 2% rate increase approved by council on May 26th for 2022 to advance the lead service connection program. So with 2021 having been the last year of that previously approved 3% rate increase for each year, new rates and time periods will be proposed as part of the 2022 budget when we bring it forward. So I think at this point, Chris, we'll just maybe we'll just ask if there's any questions at this point, and then I'll just have Mr. Holden make some concluding remarks with respect to the timelines of the budget process.
Councillor Hawkins.
Thank you very much. For some time I've been convinced that our cost recovery rates are too low, that in fact that for services for which we can charge cost recovery fees that we're not capturing everything. For example, as a trivial example, the cost of this council meeting isn't recovered anywhere where we've dealt with service delivery. And I'm also basing my impression on the fact that Saskatoon appears to have higher cost recovery rates for just about everything they do. What, if anything, are we doing to deal with this kind of situation?
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for that. Thank you for the question, because I think it's an important question. So currently, we're working on reviewing our current cost recovery policy, and I anticipate coming out of that we'll be making changes and amendments to it. Following that, we'll be applying that policy and reviewing all of the rates and charges that we provide for services to determine whether or not we're charging enough or too much, or whatever the case might be. So we are actively, I guess, I would like to leave committee members that we are actively looking at our policy, and then intend to go back and look at how we apply what we charge, and is that charge appropriate given the costs associated with providing that service.
Great, thank you very much.
Any other questions? Seeing none, this communication is a receive and file.
Sorry.
Oh, I see one now.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Councillor Berchine.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor. So I just, in regards to the 5% that you've indicated, 5% mill, the mill rate increase of 5%, okay? So you've talked about the property tax and the reserve that'll come out of reserves for the 2.1 and the HIP 2.5. So I guess the question is, we received, and I know we still have effects from the COVID as you've indicated, but we had received, was it how many, 13 million or something like that from the federal government. So is there anything that is still within that discussion, that there's any dollars there that could be utilized here through the chair?
Through you, Mr. Chair, so thank you for that question. So the City of Regina did receive from the federal government a little over $16 million related to COVID recovery funding. 2 million of that was used with respect to the Regina Economic Grant Program. And then as part of the 2021 budget, we had identified approximately 12 million in COVID-related financial impacts in the city. And so that 16 million, part of that 16 million was used to offset that 12 million impact. So essentially we have just a little over 2 million left in the COVID-19 recovery reserve that Council established last year that currently is uncommitted. And you know, those funds are obviously there to be used towards COVID recovery initiatives or decisions of council, whether it relates to any additional decisions this year or potential use of that reserve to cover off any COVID costs that extend into 2022.
Okay. I guess the other question that I know I always ask this, when we look at our projects that we're doing, is there ever a discussion to say, I mean, we look at, and this is what I think, I'm just going to speak, residents see that, you know, the growth of our city, so the city is collecting more taxes. But it seems the more taxes we collect, the more we spend. So how do we kind of bring our budget back to where we need to kind of live within our budget and say, okay, yes, we need to build over here, we need to develop over here, but yet we have to stay within our means. It seems like the more taxes we get, the more we spend. So how do we narrow that to say, okay, maybe there's a project. So when we say 5% mill rate increase, and I know that's just where we're starting, but I mean, this year was, again, with the assessment in that, many residents have seen a real jump in their taxes, which was unfortunate because of the times we're in. So again, I'm going to ask the question is that, do we ever consider when we are looking at a mill rate like this, some of the projects that maybe we cannot move forward, or we scroll down on maybe doing, like we continue to spend over $1 million on all these studies and all of these contracts and all of these, you know, again, looking at the rail lands, and it never ends. So how do we then maybe say, well, listen, those are things that maybe for this year, that's $1 million, that would bring it down a little bit. When does that discussion ever happen?
So, through you, Mr. Chair, you know, when we talk about our expenditures and the amount of revenues that we bring in, and if there's a gap. At the end of the day, there's only three ways in which, well, in my view, to address it when you look at what are the three key ways. So one is obviously through looking at cost savings or efficiencies in the organization is one, and I think that we've done quite a bit of that over the last couple of years, and we have another initiative that we're currently in to look at finding other opportunities for savings through the efficiency review. So that's one. The second one is to look at revenue increases, whether that be through property taxes or, as Councillor Hawkins has indicated, making sure that we're recovering through our user fees an appropriate amount to cover off our costs to provide that service. And then the third one is really service levels. And so, when we speak to our infrastructure projects, we think of capital projects because you had mentioned some of the things you had mentioned are really kind of capital expenditures. And capital expenditures are really all about service delivery and your ability to provide services, because you need that infrastructure to provide services. So that really is a service level conversation as well when you make decisions around how much do you want to spend on infrastructure. So, there's those really three areas to look at when you're looking at balancing the budget or reducing the budget. We as administration, through the budget process, as I had mentioned when we were talking about the process for the multi-year budget, we do a fair amount of that internally already before we present a proposed budget to council or a draft for discussion and consideration by council. And so a lot of what you've described, those discussions occur with respect to making trade-offs and decisions about what we believe are appropriate to advance or not advance or to trim back. And so I think it's fair to say that what we present to council has gone through a significant vetting process already at an administrative level. I very much view the budget process, once a proposed budget is put in front of council, that's the opportunity for council to further challenge and have that discussion about whether or not we have an affordable budget. Because I think essentially at the end of the day what you're talking about is, do we have an affordable budget for the residents of Regina, which is quite subjective and ultimately, in my view, rests with City Council. And so I think that's really where the opportunity happens, in addition to the vetting administration has done internally, is the opportunity to have those discussions with council members, as we bring a further update to council in September or October, or as actually part of the budget deliberation process, which is anticipated to occur in December after we release the proposed budget, to talk about, is this affordable? And if it's not affordable, which of these three levers I've just described do we want to use to reduce the budget and reduce the overall amount of property tax mill rate increase being proposed, whatever that is. I hope that's helpful. That was a long answer, Councillor Bresciani, but I'm hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, no, I understand that it comes, thank you for that. It comes back to us at council, and we can, I guess I'll just make a comment that I think there's a few things that we've learned over the time, and I think that, it is about also quality of service, and I don't want to reduce the service levels. And over time, sometimes with a thinner budget, right, and I'll use parks as one. I'll just use that, or I'll use, where sometimes the residents of Regina see that as a service, and it's an essential service, because for some, they don't leave Regina. That's their park in the summer, and that's what they, right? The quality of life, so when we balance all that, yes, we've got infrastructure, which is key, like as you've indicated, recreation, which the previous council brought in that 0.5, quality of life again. I just think that every year when we're, if we start at the 5, I don't know what that's going to end up at, but what does that sacrifice mean? And I think I don't want to take away from the services. I would rather take away from, the $1 million that we approved to do all those 5 areas of town for servicing, the land development that we own. I'm just saying, if we had to pick and choose a few, because that's down the road, to try and I mean, I know that's a Band-Aid approach, but just in the times we're in, it's not a good time to have this high mill rate. That's all I'm saying, so I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Councillor Shaw.
I have a question through the chair. Now, this came to me as being a newly elected official that got a raise before we became elected, and the backlash and the ridicule that we as councillors received for that raise, especially during a time like this, was immense. What I question, though, is we see $3.9 million increase in our salaries within the city. Nobody discusses that. That's just status quo. That's the way it is. Is there any possibility of saying, you know what, during this time, we've had a rough few years, can we just cap it for this year and take that away through the chair? Is that even a possibility through the chair?
So thanks for the question, and through the chair. So that $3.9 million, the majority of that comes from our negotiated agreements. Mm-hmm. So our contracts end for the majority of our unions at the end of 2021, and we'll actually be moving into discussions for 2022. So, I mean, we're always cognizant of, you know, the financial position of the city, and that, you know, comes into play when we negotiate with our unions and associations. But those are contractual obligations that are negotiated that ultimately get approved by council. And obviously there's sensitivities around that. So we're not in a position to simply put a freeze in or hold back negotiated responsibilities that we have. But absolutely when we negotiate, there's a sensitivity and appreciation for the financial position of the city and the ability to afford whatever we're able to negotiate. But it is through an open negotiation that the majority of those increases, that's where they come from.
So during that negotiation, will you negotiate a 0% increase through the chair?
So through
will that
you,
even be on the table?
Through you, Mr. Chair, obviously, you know, negotiations occur behind closed doors. You know, there'll be conversations with council in terms of what the mandates will be, but at this point it'd be totally inappropriate to get into conversations about what negotiations will look like. That is through the collective bargaining and negotiation process.
Right. So a follow-up, I was just asking, now we have a point, what is it, 0.5 for the Mosaic Stadium. That's correct, right, through the chair? So when does that end? I think it's coming up soon, is it not, through the chair?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So that 0.5 was to occur over 10 years, and so 2022 is the 10th year.
Is the 10th year. So 2023, that 0.5 won't be in the increase anymore.
That's correct.
Okay. All right, that's all the questions I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. I see no further questions now. I guess this is a receive and file. And I have this city clerk call the vote.
Thank you. I will be. Who moved? Thank you. I'll begin with Councillor Shaw, please.
I approve.
Councillor LeBlanc.
In favor.
Councillor Pindura.
In favor.
Councillor Bresciani.
In favor.
Councillor Stevens.
In favor.
Councillor Hawkins.
In favor.
Councillor Stadnicek.
In favor.
Councillor Zahidniak.
In favor.
Mayor Masters.
In favor.
Councillor Mancinelli.
In favor.
Passes 10-0, Deputy Mayor.
Thank you. We will now consider item EX 21-51, the town's annual update. Can I ask someone from administration to introduce the report? Mr. Lacey.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. So the purpose of this report is to provide council an annual high-level overview of the city-owned town's South Land Development Project. A key highlight is the impact of COVID, an unexpected impact, which has resulted in unexpected increased demand for housing, not only here in Regina, but across Canada. So you'll see increased sales in the report. The net result of the COVID for the towns was obviously more lot sales than what we had originally anticipated. So this report is just basically an annual report that we bring forward that speaks to the development activity at a high level that has occurred in the town's south development to date, shows what the profit was in the previous year and what the future profit projections are for the town's south land development. And the only other flag that is in that report, not a flag, but what is in that report is that when we were before council a year ago, we had projected what the return on investment was, which was quite low. At that time, we had also committed that we would be going back and working with the land developer that we've contracted with to see if there were opportunities to increase the overall profitability of Town South. And so there are some concept plan amendments coming forward to the Regina Planning Commission. Actually, this afternoon, we'll be at the Commission for discussion. And so the change in profit projections are reflected in the report.
Thank you very much for that. Can I have someone move the receive and file on this report? Councillor Stevens. Any comments or any comments from council on this report? Councillor Hawkins.
Thank you. I have a question. What changes have you made to increase profitability? And in particular, are these changes related to increasing density?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I will ask Mr. Morose to, I'll refer that question to Mr. Morose.
Thank you, Mr. Lacey, through the chair. Essentially, we identified some time ago that the concept plan that we have is not a very efficient concept plan in terms of infrastructure relative to saleable land. There's always a bit of a balance of how much road you put in relative to how many lots you can actually sell. It's a bit of art, a bit of science. And so working with Terra, we've created a more efficient plan where we actually invest less infrastructure, less roadways, and we're able to increase the saleable amount of land. So that does result in increased density depending on how big the lot sizes ultimately are carved out. So we'll have more saleable land. If we make small lots, there'll be increased density. If there's bigger lots, there'll be static density, if that helps.
Thank you. I have a comment on this. This sounds like exactly the recipe that got Harbour Landing into trouble. Small roads, too small lots. Through Councillor Findura this afternoon, I hope this is something that Planning Commission takes account of, and when it gets to council, I want to be very specific about road sizes, because in Harbour Landing we have problems now with roads that are so small you can't get a service vehicle down them during the winter when there's snow. And I worry a bit about lots that are two sizes, about trying to build a house on every blade of glass in order to increase profitability, but destroy neighborhoods. So I just want to flag some cautions here. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Hawkins. Next up, we have Councillor Zakidniak.
Thank you. So my first question through the chair is, when the charts talk about the net income, is that for the city of Regina, or in the net income category is some of that then diverted to Terra? I'm just trying to understand what portion of it is ours, or if those numbers reflect purely income for the city.
Through you, Mr. Chair. So those numbers are reflective of what the city's profit is. The expenses do include the commission costs that we paid to Terra Developments.
Okay, thank you. I think that's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Zakiniak. Next up, we have Councillor Bresciani.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask about Appendix A. It's got 2 parks in there, and then Appendix B has 1 park in there. Higher density, very high density. And was that the reason that the park was taken out, was because of profit, to meet more of a profit, so it's profitable for the city? Is that the intent, through the chair?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I will ask Mr. Morose to maybe walk through the changes between Appendix A, which is the current concept plan, and Appendix B, which I believe is the plan that's before the Planning Commission this afternoon, and the reasons for why some of the, maybe you can expand upon some of the reasons for some of the changes that were made. You are right, the MR5 park initially is not in the new plan, but the intention is to shift that park to the town's north development, which will occur in a future phase. But I will ask Mr. Morose to expand further on the changes in the concept plans that will be before the Planning Commission later today.
Thank you, Mr. Lacey. Through the chair. So there's essentially two changes relative from Appendix A to Appendix B. Anything north of Buckingham Drive under Appendix A, which is the currently approved concept plan, nets us a loss of about $3 million, a little over $3 million. So profitability is certainly something we were thinking about when we're making these changes. There's 2 changes, and they're a little bit blended when we're talking about profitability. Councillor Hawkins' point is well taken about narrow roads, and that's not something we're certainly striving for. What we've come up with in Appendix B, and it's a little bit difficult to articulate visually, we end up with less roadways, less intersections. Every time you have an intersection and more roadway, your cost goes up and your land sales goes down. So we've got less roadway infrastructure, which means less underground piped infrastructure and therefore less cost. As well, MR5, there's definitely a cost to that. And again, this is a bit of a balance, because obviously a park's a wonderful thing. So the decision has been to shift it northward onto the town's north, which is future development. So it's a blending of initiatives to try and drive the profitability from red to black on this project. Good, Chair.
Thank you. The 50 person per hectare, the density target that we have to meet in the OCP, what is the density target for this, through the chair?
I'll refer that question to Mr. Morose, Mr. Chair.
Through the chair, if I could refer this to Diana Harlick, I think she's dealing with the application. I don't have that number offhand.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, if you could just give me 1 second. I do have that. I believe it went from 52, 54.25. I'm just trying to, that's the new, or pardon me. The projected population for the town's concept plan will be increased by 396 people, or 3.04%. So it went from 6,789 to 7,185, or 55.43 persons per hectare from 54.25.
So we're at 55 person per hectare rather than the 50? Is that accurate?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, that's right. The current concept plan, with the previous 2 amendments that were made, was at 54.25, and if these amendments are approved, it would go up to 55.43.
Okay. Last question I have is regarding density. If there was an opportunity here where we've heard that many times larger lots are wanted at the 50 person per hectare Could that be done through the chair?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, concept plans can be amended. The 50 persons per hectare is on the overall, so yes, that could be allocated as long as they stay within that density target as an overall target for the area.
So to be clear, that density target is not on per development that comes forth to planning, the 50 person per hectare. So a development could come forward and it could be 30 person per hectare, and that would be approved?
When we look at the concept plans, we're looking at the overall concept plans and the overall densities for the whole Southeast neighborhood plan. So you will see pockets where it's just R1. You'll see higher densities where it'll be 60, 70 persons per hectare, like large apartment buildings. But what we're trying to do is on average hit the 50 persons per hectare overall.
So through the chair, so it would be very few wider lots in order to meet that 50 person per hectare is my point. To get the 50 person per hectare, it has to be within that 50 person per hectare. So we couldn't have a whole bunch of larger lots if that was in demand, because we'd have to meet, it could fall within under that threshold through the chair. Is that accurate?
Through the chair, we're looking, you're right. I mean, it would depend on the overall concept overall, like the whole Southeast neighborhood plan as the larger. So if some areas have, some lots have high density, that accounts for those persons per hectare and can make up for those larger lots that have a lower density, then it's on an average. So you can't look at it in isolation. You have to look at it from the larger overview.
Okay. I guess the question I have moving forward, and I think we have talked about this long, I think when we hear that it's got to be profitable, I think we also have to weigh in quality of life. And I've talked about density to my colleagues, to whoever will listen. I don't think the city of Regina, the residents of Regina are super happy with this high density housing. And, but I understand that was the decision made years ago. And I know that developers have to follow through what the official community plan, how it was written. But I do think in future we do need to have a discussion about looking at our dense neighborhoods. And I guess the last question I have is, do we increase our recreation and our programming for dense neighborhoods? Do we increase that? So I know it's about a 1.3 spread for you need for a rink to, do we now with the increased density, like it's almost double the density, do we now increase those recreation and programs for those high dense neighborhoods? Through the chair.
Through you, Mr. Chairman. So through the rec plan, we do have requirements with respect to some of the metrics are based on the densities of the different areas for certain types of programs. Others are in proximity and doesn't have to do with density. So it depends on the use. I might ask Ms. Daradich to talk about the plan and how and what is based on density versus other metrics. The one thing though is from a park space perspective, through the Planning and Development Act, we're only allowed to take the 10% unless the density is actually, and don't quote me, I believe it's 65 people per hectare before we can actually ask for more than the 10%. I can verify that number, what the Act says, but it is higher than what is required. When the Planning and Development Act, I think you might, for those that were on council before, when the Planning and Development Act was getting changed, our municipal reserve allocations, schools used to be taken, bought by the ministry, and now they're taken from our MR. So we are losing what I would call like programmable park space for schools because the ministry is no longer buying those. And we did, for those that are new, did write to the ministry and had a whole conversation about how that impacts our park spaces and our densities when we have density targets that we're trying to hit. But I might ask Ms. Derdich to just go through the metrics that are based on density.
Through the chair, as Ms. Harlock has indicated, there are a variety of metrics used in the recreation master plan. Some of those are based on population, and others are based on things such as walking distance, like you had mentioned, Councillor Bresciani, with respect to outdoor rinks. So when it comes to our athletic fields, as an example, we require one athletic field per 3,600 residents. We have the same type of metric for ball diamonds, for spray pads. And so it really depends on the type of recreation amenity that we're looking at. And as Ms. Harlock indicated, we receive in residential development 10% dedicated space for MR, and then some of that may be used for schools. And so we have to balance what we're receiving for park space with the recreation amenities that are being proposed for that specific neighborhood.
Okay. Again, you know, I think it's, for myself, I think we can't be, I mean, we've got an OCP in place, and I know that we put that in place so developers can follow those guidelines to get houses and develop houses, but I do hope, and I'm going to ask Ms. Harlock, is to the OCP and the discussions around density, when do we reach out to the communities to find out, I guess, to report on that's the type of neighborhood that they want, or the city in general about density? Through the chair.
Through you, Mr. Chairman. So we will be doing a market analysis as per the request, the report that came forward with regards to infill, and there was a request from council that we do a market analysis of why people move to greenfield areas versus the core areas. So we'll ask that question, but we don't typically go back to ask those questions. When the OCP was created, the density requirements, or the density that was proposed, was to meet a number of different objectives. And I believe the motion, there is going to be a request for a motion from yourself to look at that density requirement, and we'll do the work should that motion or that undertaking be passed. But we wouldn't go back out to ask those market questions. I think what you're seeing with our own land development is when these changes, they're trying to meet and address the needs of the market that they're seeing. And so that's what we're trying to adhere to. I know there's been some questions about the amount of single family dwellings units, and we're open to looking at that to allow for that, to allow the market to have that. But I think in the overall plan, developers can come in and request those changes. And in this case, they're requesting it, and it's within the parameters of the OCP. The MR is going to be dedicated into the next phases, so we won't lose any of the municipal reserve. It just comes down to a density, and right now the OCP is a minimum of 50 persons per hectare overall.
Okay, thank you. I'll let others ask questions. Thank you.
Next up, we have Councillor Stevens.
Great, thanks. I just want some clarification on the process. So I heard that this will go to planning, but maybe I'm mistaken how that was communicated. This is a receive and file, it goes to council. Can you please clarify that?
Mr. Lacey.
Thank you, Councillor Stevens, for that question and the opportunity to provide clarification. So I've talked to council members before when it comes to land development and the city's land development activities. We wear two hats and council wears two hats. And one hat is as the land developer or as the business that's developing the land. That's one hat. We're here today with this report wearing that hat. That's why it's a receive and file. Administration, and that's handled, that business development's handled through my area in my portfolio as exec director of financial strategy and sustainability. The other hat's the regulator hat, I like to call it, or the planning regulator hat, which is worn by Ms. Howerluck. And we, as a developer, so my area, acts just like any other private sector developer. So if we want to make changes to the concept plan, we have to go through the regulator or the planning area and through Regina Planning Commission. Terra Developments does that on our behalf. And so that goes through the regulatory arm of the city. So what you have before you here is really us kind of coming to our board as a land developer and telling you how last year went and what kind of changes we plan on making going forward with respect to the development of these city lands. What we're flagging for you here as our kind of board is that, oh, by the way, we have to go through a regulatory function as well, and it's just coincidental that it's happening on the same day as the executive committee meeting here. So we might be getting the two mixed up. We're here today kind of as your land developer, reporting to you as your board, and telling you as our board that we're going in front of the regulator this afternoon with respect to some elements of the development.
Perfect, thank you. So that makes the decision for me much easier. As a board member with land holdings, what I'm being told is that administration, the team responsible for this, is adjusting the planning design so we can maximize revenue. Great, you're doing your job. I'd also say that's even better considering we just came from a budget discussion where there was concerns about how do we generate revenue to match service and capital expectations. This is how it's done by my estimate. So when I'm seeing that there's money in development, big surprise. We also have experts that are telling us this is what we have to do to balance different considerations in this area. So it sounds like this is actually what we should be supporting from a financial sustainability standpoint. From a planning perspective, I see nothing about this that suggests that the quality of life will go down. As someone who lives on a small lot, we can live happy lives with narrow yards and be quite content with parks in our community. So I think this balances a bunch of objectives. Happy to see this go forward.
Thank you, Councillor Stevens. Next up, we have Councillor Shaw.
Just to follow from Councillor Andrews' comment, he's happy to live on a small lot. I personally am not. And what I'm finding in this, in my short term on council, is the people that are living on smaller lots are paying 4 times as much property tax as I am, getting less services. When do we ask the people in Regina, what do you want? Not just what we have in place and this is the way it's going to be, but we have newcomers coming to Regina. We have all different types of people, and we're trying to be diverse and you know, make everybody, not everybody happy, but trying to be anyway, diverse. So what my question is we're always going by 50 people. Where's this room to adjust as our growth and the people are coming into Regina? Where is that put in place, and how can we put that in place through the chair?
Ms. Harlock.
Through you, Mr. Chairman. So I'll start and I'll try and, yeah, so the OCP, so I just pulled up what the policy is, and it says that ensure that new neighborhoods and employment areas maximize infrastructure investment and quality of life through compact and integrated built form. Right. And so it says achieve a minimum gross population density of 50 persons per hectare. So when we look at a gross area, so we look at the southeast, they have a neighborhood, or they have a neighborhood plan. And so overall, we look at how do we achieve a bunch of different policies that we have in the OCP and other documents where we want to have a diverse housing options. And so that includes single family dwellings and multi-unit dwellings and everything in between that, rentals, home ownership, etc. So the 50 is a number, a minimum gross. And so it does allow for single family dwellings to be built. But overall, we're looking for that. As I indicated, I've been working with Councillor Bresciani, and she's going to be, I think, bringing a motion, I'm not sure when, she'll have to answer that, about us reviewing the 50 persons per hectare. At the end of the day, it's not that we're excluding single-family dwellings, but I think what's happening is the bigger the lot, the higher the costs. And so those are, and I won't go into the land development, I could talk about it, but that's where the land development side is saying to maximize profitability, they're changing their design, they see a market for this type of unit, and that's what's selling. And so we can create more single family lots. It doesn't mean that that's what the market will bear if the costs are higher. So I think we're trying to find a balance on the whole spectrum of housing to provide all different forms of housing. When we're looking at the overall area, each developer decides what within their own markets, what they're going to provide.
Are you going to add to that? Oh, sorry, it looked like you were going to say something. So we are saying this is what the market wants, this is what the market demands. So we're going based off the market. When was the last market analysis done?
So again, that's not,
Through the chair.
I'll have to refer
I'm
that
not,
to
I'm
the
just
developer.
asking, I just don't know,
Yeah.
so I'm just asking through the chair.
Through you, Mr. Chair, maybe I'll ask Mr. Morose just to speak a little bit about like the market environment. Looking at it from a developer perspective, I appreciate the OCP has a density target of 50. It's in the OCP. That's a plan approved by council. Council wants to change that number. Council can change that number to a different number. And I think that's in part about a potential motion coming forward that Ms. Harlock was referring to. Then I think the other factor, which Ms. Harlock touched on, is relating then to, well, what will the market bear? And what does the market want? Which is then really driven by people looking to buy lots. And that's influenced likely by what their desire is, but also what their affordability is from a price point. Larger lots typically cost more. With respect to the overall market and how that impacts the development of the town south and the thinking around concept plan and changes in the concept plan and the marketability of our lands, I'll ask Mr. Morose if he has some comments that he could provide committee members.
Yeah, through the chair, thank you. So with respect to detailed market studies, we actually rely on our Terra Developments as our external land development manager. They're in constant communication with the building industry on a daily basis, seeking input and feedback in terms of what's selling, what's not selling. Sometimes the single family house is selling, sometimes the semi-detached is selling, sometimes the townhome's selling, sometimes the apartment's selling, sometimes they're all selling. It's a constant dynamic environment. Builders will go and build 100 duplexes, and then the market will dry up, and then they'll go back and build 100 single family homes. So it's quite dynamic. In terms of, and I'll just speak candidly here, in terms of density, this is my perspective. Regina, for many years, was built on 50-foot lots. And it wasn't that long ago you could buy a 50-foot lot for $50,000 because that's what the market would bear, and you could actually produce a lot for under $50,000. That wasn't that long ago. Now, the market is about $4,000 a front foot, so $200,000 for a 50-foot lot. And you can produce that lot for less than $200,000. The reality is there's not a lot of there's a lot of people that want a 50-foot lot, but there's not a lot of people that can actually afford a 50-foot lot. So now we have to get into what can people actually afford. The other part with respect to density is, again, I'm speaking candidly here, for a long time, the perception of the single-family, large lot neighborhood, this is across Canada, is deemed urban sprawl, and urban sprawl is not desired. Thus, the shift across the country towards more diverse neighborhoods with single-family, semi-detached, and apartment-style developments. I think the magic is in the art and how those things are executed. I think if a developer does a good job aesthetically, the market can be well satisfied. It's a bit of art, it's a bit of science, but historically, 50-foot lot became a bad thing in the urban sprawl realm, and that was a big shift. So between the shift away from urban sprawl and the high cost, we are where we are, and this is what we produce. And those are my comments, and I'll happily answer any more questions.
So just to clarify, through the chair, so we haven't done a market analysis, but you always resort back to Terra Developments. Am I correct in that? And they kind of, since they're developers, they know what's going on. Is that correct in what you said?
Yes, through the chair, that is correct. They are our boots on the ground, and we take feedback from them. And the feedback that I just relayed to you is the feedback that they've shared with us.
Okay, thank you. That's all.
That's all. Thank you, Councillor Shaw. Next up, we have Councillor Hawkins.
Thank you very much. In 1958, John Kenneth Galbraith wrote a definitive book called The Affluent Society. And the theme of that book was that unlike the prevailing idea that demand produces supply, in fact, supply produces demand. One of the reasons that we have gone to smaller lots is because developers can make more profit selling smaller lots than they could make selling bigger lots. And so developers presented concept plans and then amended concept plans to increase their profit. And that's what's going on here. The city, in fact, is a developer, and it's acting like a typical developer. Councillor Bresciani is exactly correct when she said, where's the calculation for quality of life? And the difficulty is it's hard to put a number on quality of life, and it's easy to put a number on profit. When we, as councillors, take off the development hat and look at the well-being of our community hat, we have to take quality of life seriously. I appreciate Councillor Andrews' point that he lives on a smaller lot. It's a lovely older neighborhood, has a number of compensating characteristics. But it doesn't mean that we should, as councillors, considering the quality of life of our citizens, do what we did in Harbour Landing, which was when the downturn in the economy came in 2008, we took a concept plan that was wonderful and turned it into a concept plan that was very weak because it was too dense. So the axiom, the mantra that urban sprawl is bad, that density is good, really needs another rethink. And it needs another rethink in an area like Regina. We're not Vancouver. We're not hemmed in by mountains. We do have a large supply of land. So it's not necessarily the case that we have to build subdivisions that are too dense. And that's what the town subdivision that we're talking today looked like to me. I looked at the plan, and I did think there's a house on every lot here. I don't think it has to be that way. I'm hoping the Planning Commission has a serious debate about this. I'm very pleased that the coincidence which Mr. Lacey has referred to has happened today, because it illustrates two very different philosophies about how we develop our cities. One philosophy, articulated by Councillor Andrews, says, let's look at profit. Another philosophy says, let's not forget quality of life. Those are my comments.
Thank you, Councillor Hawkins. Councillor Zakidniak.
Thank you. So I do have a few comments myself. One of them is in relation to the question about what do our residents want, and so the current density target reflected in the OCP came from the residents of Regina. Residents were an integral part of that process. My understanding is that the process that we went through to develop the official community plan, Design Regina, was an award-winning process, partially because of our extensive consultation with the residents. So the number that we have right now did come from the residents of Regina. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong there. And then the other thing I wanted to note is that, you know, we talked about taxes as well today and projected future tax implications and constraints. And one of the impacts of decreasing density would be additional strains for folks, additional property tax increases. With decreased density, we need additional infrastructure. And to support that additional infrastructure, one of the ways that we would have to consider doing that is with property tax increases. So I just think that that is also relevant for folks to consider when they think about the desire to decrease density in our community and what do residents want. So I just wanted to point out those two things because they haven't been mentioned yet. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Zakidniak. Councillor Bresciani.
Thank you. I'll just make a couple comments to Councillor Zakidniak's point that she speaks of about the density back in when the OCP was done. It was before my time, but what I understood was there was a shortage of housing at that time, and there was a real need to get housing on the go, shortage of rental housing. So there was a real panic. And there was a drive from, I understood, a lot of staff here that worked from the east down in Toronto and larger cities where they wanted density. Density is, and when I look at our sister city, Saskatoon, they have a lower density and they can accommodate all types of neighborhoods. I don't think we should be saying that you have to live in a narrow lot. You have to live in a smaller home. Because I'll tell you why. And this is exactly what is happening now. We have residents that would like to live in an area with a larger home, in a larger area with larger homes. And but because they cannot find that larger lot that's going to, yes, cost more, we can put a larger home on it, they are actually looking outside to our the RMs, so Emerald Park in White City, because guess what? You can find a large lot out there. So I think it's in our best interest to make sure that we have lots for every kind of income and type of home that people want to live in. That's my point. But I'm going to make a point here on this, what we're talking about here, and this is. I know Terra Developments has worked very hard with the city administration. The plan you saw in Appendix A was for 2 parks. Then I think it was discussed that they needed to find more efficiencies and I guess productivity, went back to 1 park. I think it would be unfair now for us to say, okay, go back and try and figure this out again, because they have to follow the OCP. Until we make changes to the OCP, then developers know what to follow. Developers then know. So I don't think it would be fair to say we can't approve this today, or that would be a planning decision. But we put these things are in place, and I think we have to, that's why they're there. But I want to say this, and when we move forward, I'm thinking down the road. I do have a motion coming. It is already submitted to the clerks. And I think that it is a discussion that we need to have, where we should be able to find and build a range of housing for individuals in this city who want to live in a larger lot or a bungalow type of a condo that has someone who's elderly that cannot do stairs. So again, I will be supporting this today, and again, until we make changes to the OCP, but I do hope that we have more discussions. There's a few other things in the OCP that need to be discussed, and I won't discuss it here today, but there are some changes that are needed. Thank you.
Thank you. I see we have Councillor Shaw up again, and then I'll comment after.
So I have a question to administration through the chair. How long ago was this OCP conducted?
Through you, Mr. Chairman. So the OCP was approved on December 16, 2013, and ministerial approval was given March of 2014, and we did a 5-year review. I believe it was last year we brought that forward to council. So we did do a 5-year review, and then there'll be another larger review at the 10-year mark.
So I have a question, I'm not sure if you know this. I was looking up some information, and single-family homes are outweighing multifamily homes by 2 to 1. And that's recent surveys that have been done. So my question is, 8 years ago this was developed, it was reviewed a year ago. Was this data taken into account when this was reviewed through the chair?
Through you, Mr. Chairman. So the policies around the density are larger than just the single families. It has to do with infrastructure and maximization.
Right.
The old OCP, and I'm just trying to find the email, and I apologize, I can't find it, but I can tell you the old OCP had, I believe it was around 40 persons per hectare overall. So this is a minimum. If council wishes to change it to 40, it's a minimum.
Right.
So at the end of the day, then it's just setting what we want in terms of the minimum densities. It can go back to what it was before. The old OCP it was set up, structured a little bit differently. But if it's that you want to limit, so when it sets a minimum, then developers just have to meet that minimum target, which means they could all come in for all high density as long as they meet the minimum. If you want a certain amount of single families or that's a different question. And then that's a maximum conversation, maximum density.
Okay, so just to further, so you reviewed it last year. When was the last engagement done though for that OCP? Was that 8 years ago that engagement was done?
So the large engagement was in 2013, then the 5-year review, because it was such a newer document, we didn't do the same amount of engagement. We went back to the development industry. We went back to those that were on our mailing list. We have a very large mailing list with lots of people that are interested in this document. And then, of course, there was a public report that came to executive where people could make comments, and then council brought that report forward. And there was a number of amendments at that time. Sorry, I can tell you right now, the report, it was it was 2014. I apologize. I think it was 2019. I'll have to look at the exact date that it came forward. But this was the document that came forward to council that talked about all the work that we had done on the OCP, and then there was a number of amendments that were brought forward at that time to council. So those were changes to the OCP made.
I just think that we need to look into this further, and I'm going to appreciate some changes being made moving forward. Yeah, that's all I have to say. Thank you.
I see no other speakers. I guess I'll just make a couple comments of my own. I speak to residents on a regular basis about taxes. None of them want taxes to go up. If I have 100 feet of frontage and 10 lots at 10 feet, there's 10 taxpayers. If I have 100 feet of frontage and 9-foot lots, I now have 11 taxpayers. Someday I hope to retire. If I follow the formula they used in previous years as a taxpayer in my adult life, I will never retire. So I appreciate the density talk, and I really enjoy having a single-family home on a larger lot. But I think that that's something that can be achieved, and people can achieve it, but can't be subsidized or given away easily for quick sales. So I appreciate this conversation, but I think the density is so important to our future. And I just wanted to really force that home. This is a receive and file. I guess we can take a vote on it.
Please.
In favor.
Councillor Stadnicek.
In favor.
Councillor Hawkins.
In favor.
Councillor Bresciani.
In favor.
Councillor Fintura.
In favor.
Councillor LeBlanc.
In favor.
Councillor Shaw.
In favor.
Councillor Zahidniak.
In favor.
Mayor Masters.
In favor.
Councillor Mancinelli.
In favor.
Carries 10-0, Deputy Mayor.
Just a comment, we're moving towards private session now. If I could get a resolution, and in conjunction with that, when we recess to private session, I suggest we take 15 minutes to have lunch as well and regroup after that. And I see Councillor Stevens as my mover for that motion. Any opposed?
We're back at 1:15.
Back at 1:15.
Well, 3:30 at the absolute latest.
I'm bringing my dogs here if we go till 3:30.
You sigh louder.
I'm serious. This is like neglect.
The other thing we'll have